Beneath the dust of modern Texas lies a version of this land that science still can't explain. A world of vanished rituals, stone whispers, and pre-flood enigmas carved into canyon walls and buried under waves. Before history began, someone was already here, painting gods, building ovens, moving mountains of shell, and then disappearing without a trace. Who were they? What did they believe? And why does their silence still echo across the desert? This isn't just archaeology. It's a ghost story, and we're still living in its shadow. Welcome to Texas Pre-Flood Mysteries Science Still Can't Explain. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. These stories vanish fast, and you don't want to miss what's buried next. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it on your clock right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Let's see how far and how late this mystery travels. Pre-Clovis at Buttermilk Creek. On a quiet patch of land in central Texas, where the soil is stubborn and red and the wind moves slow like an old dog limping home, archaeologists found something that shouldn't exist. Beneath the banks of Buttermilk Creek, at a place named the Deborah L. Friedkin site, they uncovered a series of ancient stone tools not remarkable in form, but in time. These tools sat beneath layers of classic Clovis artifacts, suggesting a human presence that predated the long-assumed first Americans. In other words, the story we've been telling about the peopling of the Americas might start several pages earlier. Clovis culture, with its signature fluted projectile points, has long been treated as the foundational chapter of human history in North America, dated to around 13,000 years ago. The textbook version goes something like this. During the waning Ice Age, small bands of people crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into Alaska, filtered south through an ice-free corridor, and spread across the continent in a sudden pulse of movement and ingenuity. Cue mammoth hunts, communal fire pits, and a narrative of proud, rugged expansion. But Buttermilk Creek throws a wrench in that whole heroic saga. The artifacts found there, more than 15,000 stone flakes, blades, and bifaces, come from an occupational layer dating back at least 15,500 years, possibly more. And here's where things get messier. These tools aren't quite Clovis, but they're not exactly not Clovis either. They're transitional. Maybe, or maybe not. Some say they represent a clear precursor to the Clovis toolkit, an ancestral tradition refining itself through time. Others argue they reflect a completely separate cultural lineage, evidence of a human migration that predates Clovis entirely. Either way, the implications are unsettling. It suggests that the Clovis first model, neat, clean, and satisfying, may just be a well-constructed myth wrapped in science. And myths, once they start cracking, tend to crumble. Researchers at the Friedkin site used optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, dating to determine how long the sediment around the tools had been undisturbed. That's a fancy way of saying they shined a light on ancient dirt and asked it how long it had been buried. The answer was clear enough. Those tools had been in place for thousands of years before the earliest known Clovis artifacts above them. The reaction in academic circles was, predictably, mixed. Some embraced the findings as the long-sought smoking gun of pre-Clovis presence. Others dismissed the artifacts as geofacts, stone shards shaped by natural processes, not human hands. But the sheer number of objects and the organized nature of their distribution made accidental formation hard to believe. Still, belief has never been science's strong suit. Who were these people? What language did they speak? Did they believe in gods, spirits, nothing at all? Did they laugh? Did they bury their dead? We don't know. We have no names, no myths, no bones with tattoos or cave art to decode. We have tools. Stone scraping against stone, the world's most patient form of storytelling. And perhaps the eeriest part is not that they existed, but that they vanished, like a whisper beneath the noise of history. No epic battle, no fire-scarred villages, no apocalyptic flood, just the slow fade of a culture into the ground, layered over by time and dust and other stories that claimed the stage more loudly. But the ground remembers. Which brings us to a few miles down the road to a place where the sediment is even deeper, the toolkits even more complex, and the mystery even stranger. Gault site's Pre-Clovis toolkit. The Gault site, near Florence, Texas, was once mistaken for little more than a rancher's headache. An unremarkable plot, littered with flint debris and sun-scorched brush. But under that dry crust of earth, archaeologists found one of the most densely packed Paleo-Indian sites in North America, hiding what might be the ultimate contradiction, an even earlier, even stranger pre-Clovis world. The Gault assemblage includes over 2 million artifacts. Yes, million. Blade cores, bifaces, prismatic flakes, all stacked in quiet strata beneath the unmistakable signature of Clovis culture. What's extraordinary isn't just the volume, but the fact that the pre-Clovis tools show a different logic. They're thinner, more refined, less wasteful in how the stone is knapped. It's almost like watching a language change dialects mid-sentence, familiar, but weirdly foreign. If Buttermill Creek whispered, "Something older was here," Gault shouts it. And yet, Gault also muddies the waters. Because the tools here aren't simply older than Clovis, they might not even relate to Clovis at all. Some archaeologists argue that the pre-Clovis industry here represents a separate cultural stream, a lineage that didn't lead to Clovis, but ran alongside it, or maybe even got overtaken by it. Others argue for cultural continuity, claiming the tools evolved naturally into Clovis forms over generations. The debate is heated, the evidence is silent. But here's the real kicker. The Gault toolkit shouldn't exist in Texas. According to the long-standing migration model, the people who made these tools should still be somewhere near Alaska, or at best inching southward. And yet here they are, in the heart of Texas, with an advanced lithic tradition and no clear ancestors. One hypothesis. The first wave of humans came not through the ice-free corridor, but along the Pacific coast in boats, hugging shorelines, eating kelp, and making their way south far earlier than previously thought. That would explain the early presence in South America and, perhaps, these anomalous toolkits in Texas. But the coastal routes are underwater now, swallowed by post-glacial seas. If they left breadcrumbs, they've long since dissolved. So what we're left with is a question wrapped in tools, buried under dirt beneath the feet of cows. Who were the people before the first people, and why do they seem to appear, fully formed, then vanish like smoke? Gault doesn't answer. It complicates. It suggests multiple origins, tangled lineages, and timelines that look more like spiderwebs than straight lines. And speaking of vanishing, not everyone who disappeared in prehistoric Texas left behind stone tools. Some left behind something even more haunting their bodies. Like Leanne, buried near a creek bank, almost as if she knew we'd someday dig her up and start asking impossible questions. If your brain's already spinning and we're only 2 mysteries in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more where this came from. And while the algorithm pretends not to care, I do. Where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Middle of the night? Stuck in traffic? Let me know down below. I'm collecting timestamps from across the void. Leanne. At Wilson Leonard. She was young, maybe in her late teens, maybe younger. The records of prehistory aren't great with birthdays. Her body was curled gently in a shallow grave near what's now Leander, Texas. They called her Leanne, a name as invented as the story we're still trying to tell about her. A name that sounds like someone you could have passed in a grocery store aisle, which somehow makes it all worse. Her remains were found at the Wilson Leonard site, a kind of time layer cake in the central Texas hills, one of the rare places where the timeline of human activity stretches back more than 11,000 years. When archaeologists unearthed her in the 1982nd, they weren't expecting to find a nearly complete human burial from that far back. She was a surprise, the kind that rewrites chapters instead of just footnotes. Leanne is considered one of the oldest known burials in North America. That alone should have guaranteed her a tidy spot in the grand narrative of early American migration. But nothing about Leanne has ever been tidy. First, the dating. Her remains have been placed at around 10,711,000 years old, give or take a few archaeological heartbeats. That means she lived and died during a time of profound environmental shifts, melting glaciers, changing coastlines, disappearing megafauna. The world was transforming all around her, and we don't know if she even knew it. Then there's the burial itself. She wasn't just tossed aside. Her body was positioned, purposefully, laid on her side, knees drawn up, hands tucked close. There were no grave goods, no stone tools, no beads or bones of animals laid next to her. Just her, alone in the dirt. And yet the way she was buried hints at meaning, ritual, respect, maybe grief. Or maybe it was just the most convenient way to move a body. In prehistory, meaning is a risky guess. Researchers studying the burial have tried to extract everything possible from the bones: her age, her health, her ancestry. Was she Paleo-Indian? Part of the Clovis or Pre-Clovis groups who may have migrated south from Alaska? Or something else altogether, a lineage that came earlier or evolved locally? Even now, decades after her excavation, no consensus has emerged. Her DNA hasn't told us much. She remains an outlier. Some cranial studies placed her features within a broader, pan-Pacific phenotype, a look that doesn't cleanly match modern Native American groups, but also doesn't imply anything as dramatic as a forgotten people. Just variation. Deep time diversity we still don't fully understand. The mystery deepens when you consider the broader site. Wilson Leonard isn't just the place where Leanne was buried. It's a treasure trove of stratified human activity, layers of occupation stacked over thousands of years. Stone tools, hearths, charred seeds, bones of long extinct animals. It's a prehistory palimpsest, the story of a place told over and over, each new group scraping their lives into the same soil. And right there, in the oldest layer, is Leanne. What makes her haunting is not just her age or her isolation, it's that she represents a presence, a human heartbeat in the archaeological noise, and yet we can't place her in any lineage. We can't connect her burial to a broader funerary practice. We can't point to her people on a map. She's evidence, but not explanation. Proof of something, but not of what. And perhaps that's what makes her unsettling. We like our past's orderly migration paths with arrows, cultures named and boxed, rituals explained in PowerPoint slides. But Leanne isn't interested in being orderly. She's a reminder that for every known site, there are hundreds lost to erosion, construction, or time. For every burial we find, 1,000 more were reclaimed by rivers, caves, or tree roots. Her story, if it was ever told out loud, has been erased by millennia of wind and rain. All we have now is a body in a hole. And a lingering sense that she might have belonged to a group whose entire history now rests on the width of her femur and the slope of her skull. But Leanne also proves something else, something strange and powerful. Humans were here far earlier than we thought, doing human things, burying their dead, marking meaning into soil, living and dying in the margins of rivers that have long since shifted course. And speaking of rivers, not all of Texas's prehistoric mysteries stayed buried inland. Some are still being spit out by the ocean, wave after wave, artifact by artifact. Because along the Texas coast, under 20 feet of Gulf water, another migration trail lies drowned and waiting, one that might hold the real origins of the people who became Leanne. Submerged Paleo-Indian coast at McFadden Beach. There's something inherently untrustworthy about a beach that coughs up Ice Age weapons after storms. McFadden Beach, along the Gulf Coast of Texas near Beaumont, doesn't behave like a typical shoreline. Where other beaches offer driftwood or jellyfish, McFadden offers Paleo-Indian projectile points, Clovis, Folsom, and sometimes older washing up in the surf, like whispers from a drowned world. It's not one or two artifacts, it's thousands. Stone tools, bones, even carved ivory and fossilized remains. After every major hurricane or deep erosion event, more appear. Local collectors have cabinets full of them. And while the archaeological community has long debated whether beach-found artifacts can be trusted, the answer here is reluctantly yes. Because the items are real, old, and clearly not local. The McFadden site isn't a site in the traditional sense. There's no dig, no pit, no trench wrapped in tape and orange flags. There's no clear boundary. What we're dealing with is a now submerged coastal shelf, a prehistoric landscape that existed 30 to 70 miles farther out when sea levels were lower. It was dry land, then rolling grasslands, river deltas, marshes teeming with wildlife, the kind of place that would have made an ideal settlement zone for Paleo-Indian groups. And now, it's gone. Drowned beneath the Gulf by the slow, relentless rise of post-glacial seas. But its bones are still moving. These artifacts aren't getting washed down from nearby rivers or kicked up from local dune systems. The wear patterns, sediment traces, and marine growth suggest they're being pulled from offshore, eroded from now submerged deposits, and dragged landward by storm-driven currents. In other words, they're coming from a place we can no longer reach, a place underwater that still remembers. Scientists have attempted to identify where, exactly, these artifacts originate. But the Gulf of Mexico is not a kind teacher. Sediment maps show complicated channels and silt drifts, and the underwater terrain is murky at best. Remote sensing has located a few promising features: buried riverbeds, shell ridges, and high spots that may have been dry islands 15,000 years ago, but none have been conclusively tied to the McFadden material. And yet, the clues keep coming. Among the tools found are classic Clovis points, some fluted, some not. A few appear to predate Clovis, possibly related to the Buttermilk Creek or Gault traditions. Others look like they've traveled materials traced to inland quarries like Alibates flint from the Panhandle. That implies movement, trade, or at least wide-ranging hunting routes. These weren't static people hugging the coast. They were mobile, coordinated, and sophisticated, and they lived on land that no longer exists. There's a kind of cruel irony in that. The first Texans may have made their homes not in what we now call Texas, but out where red snappers swim and shrimp trawlers drag their nets. Their hearths, campsites, and burial grounds are likely buried beneath mud and seawater, inaccessible not just to shovels, but to memory. All we get are the occasional stone point, tide-worn and sun-bleached, landing on sand like a message bottle from a time before maps. Some researchers believe this drowned shelf might have been part of the earliest migration route into the Americas. Not the well-worn Bering Land Bridge corridor, but a coastal path, a kelp highway, where early seafarers followed rich marine ecosystems down the Pacific coast and into the Gulf, long before glaciers melted. If that's true, then Texas wasn't the edge of anything. It was a thoroughfare, a port, a place where cultures met, moved, and left almost nothing behind. Almost. Because some things endure, like the bones of a mammoth dredged up by fishermen, or a projectile point found embedded in a Pleistocene bone, or the fact that we keep finding them after every storm, every hurricane, every time the sea forgets itself and throws up its secrets. The Gulf keeps trying to bury the story, but the story won't stay buried. And as it turns out, prehistoric Texas had more than one site of mass death. Not far from the Brazos River, on higher ground, another place tells a different kind of tragedy. Not a slow drowning, but a sudden, violent end. An Ice Age nursery turned graveyard. Cause of death at Hueco Mammoth. Hueco Mammoth National Monument feels like a place caught mid-scream. Beneath a quiet grove of oak trees and brush lies one of the most astonishing fossil finds in North America. a nursery herd of Colombian mammoths entombed together in what looks suspiciously like a death trap. First discovered in 1978 by two men hunting for fossils in a dry creek bed, the site revealed something no one expected: the skeletal remains of at least 24 mammoths, including several juveniles and infants, all concentrated in a relatively small area. This wasn't your typical scatter of Ice Age bones across an open plain. This was a tightly packed, layered burial, as if something had struck all at once. And no one can agree on what. The prevailing theory is flood, multiple floods actually, a series of flash floods that overwhelmed the low-lying ravine where the mammoths were grazing, trapping them in thick, rising mud. The idea is horrifying in its simplicity. One moment they're eating, nursing, moving in herd formation the next. They're knee-deep in silt, too heavy to escape, too slow to react. Some show signs of a slower death: bent limbs, collapsed hips, skulls pressed at unnatural angles. Others appear to have died standing. Several juveniles were found close to adults, suggesting protective behavior or a final, failed attempt to shield the young. But even within the flood theory, there are complications. First, the timing. Radiocarbon dating suggests these deaths occurred in stages over thousands of years. That implies multiple catastrophic events at the same location. Lightning striking twice is rare. Mudslides doing it 3 or 4 times in exactly the same kill pocket is stranger still. Then there's the absence of other fauna. You'd expect a flood to carry in or trap more than just mammoths. Where are the predators? The small mammals? The fish? Some are present, yes, but not in the numbers you'd predict. It's oddly selective, almost as if the site attracted death in a very specific way, targeting one species over time. Another theory points to tar seeps or bog traps, natural death pits disguised as safe watering holes, but the geology doesn't quite match. No clear evidence of bitumen or natural asphalt. No chemical anomalies in the surrounding sediment. Others have floated the idea of disease, drought, or even social behavior gone wrong, a herd returning to a familiar calving ground that, unbeknownst to them, had become deadly. Still others whisper the word human, suggesting the possibility of early hunting groups driving the mammoths into low terrain to ambush them. But there's no conclusive evidence of butchery or tool marks, just a lot of dead mammoths in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whatever the case, the Waco site is unnerving because it feels intentional even if it wasn't. Like nature itself set a trap and waited patiently. The layering of death here doesn't feel random. It feels like a message, and no one can agree on what it says. But there's a deeper chill when you realize this was a nursery herd. Not rogue bulls or lone wanderers, but mothers and calves. A social unit. A family. Wiped out, repeatedly, in the same exact spot. The bones are still there, suspended mid-motion, preserved in the act of dying. And just west of here, another group of ancient Texans was orchestrating death not by accident, but by design. They weren't caught by nature, they were the hunters, and the cliff was their weapon. Earliest, southernmost bison jump, at Bonfire Shelter. At first glance, Bonfire Shelter doesn't look like much. It's a high, shallow limestone alcove tucked into the dry escarpment above the Pecos River near Langtree, Texas. The kind of place you'd pass on a hike without giving it a second thought, just another dusty notch in the cliffside. But under the rubble, bones whisper a much older story. One that begins with dust, ends with fire, and hinges on one unforgettable word: stampede. Bonfire Shelter is home to the southernmost known bison jump in North America, and one of the earliest. Long before horses, long before open plains battles and cattle drives romanticized in Western lore, prehistoric Texans figured out something brutal and brilliant. Bison, for all their bulk and strength, can be tricked into running off a cliff. That's what happened here, multiple times. Excavations in the 1962nd and 72nd revealed 3 distinct bone layers, One was relatively recent within the last 1,000 years, from the late prehistoric period. But deeper down, archaeologists found something far more significant: a dense bone bed dating back more than 11,700 years to the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. This places the main event squarely in Paleo-Indian times, making it not just early, but astonishingly early. The idea of bison jumps engineered drives, where hunters funneled stampeding herds over a cliff's edge, is better documented on the northern plains, in places like Alberta or Montana. But here in Texas, in rugged canyon country, far from the open grasslands of myth, that challenges a lot of assumptions. So how did they do it? Probably with fire, noise, barriers, and careful choreography. Paleo-Indian groups would have known the terrain intimately. They would have mapped the wind, tracked bison movements seasonally, and understood how fear can be weaponized. Then, they would have constructed drive lanes, maybe using rock cairns, brush, even people lining the sides to guide the animals toward the jump. Once the herd was in motion, all that remained was gravity. But gravity makes a mess, and Bonfire's mess is enormous. The bone bed is chaotic: shattered skulls, broken limbs, crushed ribs. Many of the animals were immature, suggesting the hunt occurred in spring when bison were calving and moving in tight protective groups. The site also shows signs of fire, likely used during butchering or for waste disposal, hence the name Bonfire. The sheer scale of the kill dozens of animals, maybe more, raises questions. Was this a single group? A rare confluence of hunter coordination and opportunity? Or did multiple groups use this site over generations, returning each season for the same grim harvest? There's no village here, no permanent structures. But there are artifacts, projectile points, flake tools, scrapers suggesting intense activity. A kill and process site, where meat and hides were stripped, marrow was extracted, and bones were either burned or left to bleach in the sunday. Yet not all the bison remains were used. Some show little evidence of processing. That's led some researchers to speculate that the hunt may have been too successful. Too many animals, too little time, too few hands. Nature doesn't wait for you to catch up. Meat spoils. Priorities shift. The story gets stranger when you realize that bison weren't native to this area during much of prehistory. Their presence in this region was sporadic, linked to changing climate patterns and rainfall cycles. Which means the people who hunted here had to seize rare windows of opportunity. When the bison came, they had to be ready. And then, just like that, the bison stopped coming. No more jumps, no more bone beds, just silence, and wind, and time. Did the climate change? Did the bison change their route? Did the humans move on to other strategies or other prey? We don't know. What we do know is that Bonfire Shelter holds a snapshot of an incredibly complex behavior: cooperation, timing, ecological knowledge, risk, and none of it survived in the oral traditions we've inherited. All that remains are the bones, and even those had to be excavated before we knew they were there. Bonfire tells us that early Texans weren't wandering aimlessly. They were thinking, planning, coordinating, and when the moment came, they ran whole herds off cliffs. But while the bison disappeared, something else was disappearing too. Something much bigger, much older, and far harder to explain: the megafauna. Giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, camels, mastodons, horses, all vanished within a narrow window of time. And in one mysterious cave in Texas, their extinction is written into the bones, the dirt, and the DNA. Hines Cave extinctions. High on the Edwards Plateau, near Kerrville, there's a cave with a name as understated as its appearance. Hines Cave doesn't scream for attention. It yawns, quietly. You could walk past it and never suspect that inside, buried in layer after layer of sediment, lies a 20,000-year record of ecological collapse. A story told not with words or myths, but with fossils, pollen, and the occasional fragment of dung. It's here that the end of the Ice Age and the end of Texas's great beasts is laid out in forensic detail. Hall's Cave was a shelter for many species, but a haven for none. Over millennia, layer by layer, the floor of the cave accumulated the evidence of lives lived and lost. Bones of short-faced bears, remains of mammoths, dire wolves, giant ground sloths, and then, abruptly, none of those things. They vanish from the record, not gradually, not politely, just gone. The cave sediments are remarkably well preserved, offering a rare continuous sequence of deposits stretching back more than 16,000 years. That continuity allowed scientists to do something extraordinary. They mapped out the extinction event in real time. Using ancient DNA, stable isotope analysis, and fossil identification, they charted which species were present, in which layers, and when they stopped showing up. And they all stop at around the same time. Roughly 12,900 years ago, right at the start of what's known as the Younger Dryas. A sudden return to glacial conditions after the planet had started warming. It lasted about 1,200 years. Enough to unsettle ecosystems, enough to collapse habitats, enough to rewrite who lived and who died. But climate alone doesn't quite explain it. Because alongside the cold snap, you also get a spike in human presence. New tools, new butchering marks, new signs of human behavior entering the fossil record. And right there, in that overlap, lies the heart of the debate. Was it us? Or was it the weather? The overkill hypothesis, the idea that humans hunted North America's megafauna to extinction, has its defenders. But Hall's Cave complicates things. There's no clear kill site here, no butchered mammoth bones, no blood-soaked climax, just the silence of species after they vanish from the record. That makes the case murkier, not cleaner. Some suggest it wasn't hunting, but competition. That humans and their dogs, yes, ancient dogs, pushed other predators out of the ecological niche. Others proposed disease, or comet impacts, or a perfect storm of stressors, climate shift, habitat loss, human interference, all at once. What Hall's Cave shows is that the extinctions didn't happen in isolation. They happened in sequence, species by species, decade by decade. And the cave's pollen records tell us the land was changing too. Forests giving way to grasslands, water drying up, no single smoking gun, just 1,000 slow cuts. The extinction at Hall's Cave isn't just a tragedy. It's a mirror, because it shows how ecosystems unravel not in one cinematic moment, but in slow erosion. And it reminds us that even the giants can be erased if the pressure is constant and the system's fragile. But humans didn't vanish. We adapted, we told stories, we painted walls. And in another part of Texas, a place where the canyons are deep and the walls stretch like cathedral spires, those paintings still whisper across the stone. Not about mammoths or extinction, but about gods. Or spirits. Or something far stranger. Meaning of the Lower Pecos rock art. Step into the Lower Pecos Canyonlands of southwest Texas, and you're stepping into a cathedral not built by hands, but carved by time and painted by people we no longer understand. The rock art here doesn't whisper. It sings in symbols, towering across sandstone walls that seem too grand for the desert that now surrounds them. Sites like Panther Cave, Fate Bell, and the White Shaman mural display some of the oldest and most elaborate pictographs in North America, and despite decades of study, we still have no idea what most of them mean. These aren't your average stick figures or hunting scenes. The panels in the Lower Pecos are sprawling, multicolored, and complex, densely layered compositions up to 30 feet wide and 12 feet tall. They feature anthropomorphic figures with elaborate headdresses, dotted lines that snake across entire canyon walls, and animals that seem half symbolic, half real. The most iconic style, known as Pecos River style, flourished from roughly 4,000 to 1,500 years ago, but there are earlier and later traditions layered in, forming a palimpsest of meaning. The images are so abstract, so alien to modern eyes, that early researchers dismissed them as doodles or hunting magic. Others tried to link them to specific rituals, myths, or shamanic visions, and while those interpretations feel closer to the mark, the truth is, no one really knows. Take the White Shaman mural. It's arguably the most famous rock art panel in Texas, a 5-figure composition that many believe encodes a complex cosmology. The figures seem to interact with each other, and with lines and shapes that might represent journeys, transformations, or barriers between worlds. Some see the central figure as a deity, others as a shaman mid-transformation. Still others think the entire panel could be a visual map of an ancient peyote ceremony. All of these interpretations sound plausible. All remain speculative. That ambiguity isn't just academic, it's philosophical. Because it reveals a deeper truth. We have lost the cultural key to these symbols. We can't read them. We can describe them, measure them, chemically analyze their pigments, and yet the fundamental question remains unanswered. What were they trying to say? Some researchers argue that the art represents trance visions seen during altered states of consciousness brought on by peyote or other hallucinogens. That would align with widespread shamanic practices across indigenous cultures in the Americas. But that theory can feel like a convenient default, as if anything we don't understand must have been drug-induced. And it doesn't explain the systematic repetition of motifs, the regional consistency of style, or the incredible effort these murals required. Others suggest that the panels functioned like oral texts, visual storytelling devices used in rituals, passed down through generations. But again, we don't have the oral traditions that would decode them. Most of the groups who lived in this region either moved on or were displaced long before these meanings were recorded. What we do know is that these panels weren't casual. The artists gathered specific pigments, red ochre, white clay, yellow iron oxide, and mixed them with binders to make durable paint. Some of these colors have lasted over 4,000 years under desert Sunday. The figures were drawn with precision and patience, often painted high up on sheer rock walls that would have required scaffolding or climbing. This was sacred labor, and the locations weren't random either. The murals appear in rock shelters that were clearly occupied for long periods, places of ritual, habitation, and likely burial. This suggests the art wasn't just background decor, it was part of a lived spiritual landscape, possibly tied to initiation rites, seasonal ceremonies, or mythological reenactments. What unsettles us most is not that we don't know what the symbols mean, it's that we can feel, intuitively, that they meant everything to someone, and now that language is gone. Not lost in war, not erased by fire, just faded, slowly, by time and forgetting. But some of that language may have survived not in murals, but in pebbles, painted rocks, portable and mysterious, scattered across the same region, objects we can pick up and turn in our hands. And just like the murals, they ask the same question with a different accent. What were we supposed to see? Painted pebbles, enigma. In the same canyons where towering rock panels sprawl across the cliff walls, you might also find something much smaller. A fist-sized pebble, flattened smooth by river time, with delicate geometric designs painted in red, black, or yellow. These are the enigmatic painted pebbles of the lower Pecos region, and if the murals are the stained glass windows of this lost spiritual system, then the pebbles are its pocket scriptures. They're deceptively simple. Circles, zigzags, cross-hatch patterns, sometimes stick figures or masks. Most were painted on local limestone pebbles, with mineral-based pigments that match the ones used on the murals. Many have been found in burial contexts, especially in the Amistad Reservoir area, before it was flooded in the 1962. That detail alone suggests ritual function, but beyond that, we're mostly guessing. The number of painted pebbles recovered from archaeological sites exceeds several hundred, and while the motifs vary, they're consistent enough to suggest a shared symbolic system, maybe even a kind of visual grammar. Some archaeologists propose that they were amulets, carried for protection or spiritual guidance. Others believe they were offerings, placed in graves to accompany the dead. There's also the theory that they were used in initiation rites, tools for teaching or testing symbolic knowledge. But here's where the mystery deepens. The pigments used on these pebbles differ chemically from the ones used on the nearby rock walls. That may sound like a technicality, but it opens a philosophical can of worms. If the pebbles and murals were painted by the same people, why use different materials? Were the painted pebbles meant to be temporary, less sacred, more personal? Or were they part of a completely different tradition, one that mimicked the murals but spoke a different language? And why pebbles? Why carry heavy stone when bark or hide would have been more portable? Was weight part of the meaning, the feel of something substantial in your hand? Something grounded? Or did the permanence of stone matter in a world where memory had to outlive the storyteller? Some pebbles show evidence of wear, suggesting they were handled, not just placed and forgotten. Others have been found in caches, as if stored for future use. A few were deliberately broken, which opens even more possibilities. Symbolic destruction, the end of a ritual, or simply the result of time. The motifs themselves seem tantalizingly close to meaning. A sunburst here, a concentric circle there, echoes of astronomical alignments, cosmological diagrams. None of the designs appear random, and yet they remain mute. Researchers have tried to group the designs into typologies, looking for patterns across time and space. Some success has been found. Certain designs do cluster by era or by location, but the breakthrough never comes. The code, if it exists, stays locked. What's even more intriguing is that many of these pebbles were discovered by accident, uncovered during reservoir construction, or handed over by collectors who'd kept them for decades. That means the archaeological context is often incomplete, and with it, the interpretive key. But maybe what matters isn't solving the puzzle, but recognizing the intention behind it. Someone picked up a rock, crushed pigment, painted symbols onto its surface, and carried it with them. Or placed it in a grave, or broke it with ceremony. That's not idle behavior. That's belief, expressed through matter. The painted pebbles remind us that not all communication is meant for everyone. Some messages are private. Some stories are only meant to be understood by the dead. And some symbols were never meant to be read, only held. But belief doesn't always stay silent. Sometimes it grows teeth, especially when paired with a powerful plant, a ritual fire, and a journey that starts inside the skull. Because what came next in this prehistoric world was no longer just art, it was chemistry, ceremony, and the beginning of a spiritual pharmacology. Peyote and ritual timelines. If the murals and pebbles of the lower Pecos were a kind of visual theology, then peyote may have been the doorway into the divine, the plant through which vision became belief, and belief became behavior. But like everything else in prehistoric Texas, the story isn't linear. It's scattered across burned rock, clay residues, and whispers from ceremonial fires long cold. The big question remains: when exactly did peyote enter the ritual landscape of Texas? And what did it mean to the people who used it? Peyote lophophora williamsi is a small, unassuming cactus that grows low to the ground in the arid stretches of South Texas and northern Mexico. On its own, it looks like a green button half buried in gravel. Easy to miss, unless you know what it does. Consumed fresh or dried, peyote triggers powerful physiological and psychological effects, visions, synesthesia, altered perceptions of time and space. Across millennia, it has been revered, feared, regulated, and ritualized. Modern peyote ceremonies are well documented in Native American traditions, particularly in the Native American church. But when did this sacred relationship begin? How far back does it go? Until recently, archaeologists didn't have much to go on. The plant is fragile, rarely preserves well, and even when found, context is everything. Then came Shumla and its rock art scientists, along with chemical residue analysis and radiocarbon dating. In 2005, at Shumla Cave near the Rio Grande, researchers discovered a set of preserved peyote buttons in a dry rock shelter context. They were carefully wrapped in fiber bundles, not trash, not discard, but deliberate placements. When dated, the buttons returned a result of over 5,000 years old. That one date shifted the entire discussion. It suggested that peyote had been part of ritual practice in the region since at least the Archaic period, long before the rise of the Native American Church, long before colonial contact, long before written language. And that usage wasn't casual. It was structured, preserved, meaningful. But here's where it gets complicated. There's a gap between evidence and interpretation. A few peyote buttons in a cave don't automatically prove ceremony. They prove use. But use for what? Healing, divination, initiation? Something else entirely? The art on the canyon walls, with its spirals, composite beings, and layered human-animal figures, looks like the kind of thing you'd see in a vision, but that's reading our modern imagination into ancient symbols. It's a leap, and yet the overlap is hard to ignore. Some researchers argue that the Lower Pecos art is a visual record of trance, states that the artists painted what they saw, what they experienced, under the influence of peyote or similar hallucinogens. The use of dotted lines, merging forms, and spirit flight motifs certainly supports this. But again, without a Rosetta Stone, it's speculation. Educated, poetic speculation, but still. What's more, the ritual calendar is a blank slate. Did they use peyote seasonally? In response to crisis? Was it linked to celestial events? Coming-of-age rites? Burial ceremonies? We have almost no data. Even the distribution of peyote use across the archaeological record is uneven. It's been found in some shelters, absent in others. Was that cultural variation? Trade limits? Did some groups hold it sacred while others rejected it? Or was its use restricted to certain individuals, shamans, visionaries, spiritual mediators? These questions hang in the dry Texas air, unanswered. And yet the more we study, the clearer it becomes that peyote wasn't just a drug. It was part of a larger worldview, one that merged the physical and the spiritual, the desert and the divine, the plant and the person. A worldview that was painted onto rock and buried in graves and encoded into buttons of cactus wrapped in fiber and placed carefully into the earth. But while the use of peyote may have opened doors to spirit worlds, there's another site in Texas where spirits, or something like them, stare back directly, painted not on walls, but as faces. Not imagined, but unmistakable. And they raise a new set of questions about gods, identity, and whether masks ever truly come off. Hueco Tanks Masks. There's a place in far west Texas, just east of El Paso, where boulders rise like fossilized thunderclouds out of the desert floor. It's called Hueco Tanks, named for the natural rock basins, or huecos, that trap rainwater in an otherwise parched landscape. It's a place of survival, of refuge, and more mysteriously, of faces. Hundreds of them. Scattered across the rock walls, in hidden alcoves and sunlit ledges, are over 3,000 pictographs. More than 200 of them are masks, painted in vivid reds, blacks, and ochres. They don't resemble animals or humans so much as spirits, stylized and symbolic. Ovoid eyes, triangular mouths, geometric headdresses, concentric halos. Some peer out from within hollowed boulders like sentinels. Others seem to float in isolation, expressionless and permanent. Who were they? That's the question no one's been able to answer. The masks at Hueco Tanks resist easy categorization. They don't match the Pecos River style of Central Texas. They don't conform to Pueblo iconography, though some elements hint at southwestern influence. They seem to stand alone, their own tradition, their own logic, their own invisible doctrine. Some scholars suggest they represent deities, gods of rain, fertility, wind, or war. That would make sense. Hueco Tanks is a place of water in a dry land. A place where clouds might gather and life could reassert itself. Maybe the masks were prayers made visible. Others argue the masks were used in initiatory rituals, a kind of visual transformation where individuals would symbolically put on a spiritual identity to participate in sacred ceremonies. And still others wonder if the masks weren't just depictions, but identities. Personae worn by ritual specialists, spirit beings who temporarily became someone or something else. The painted masks would then be a kind of fossilized performance, the final snapshot of a transformation that once moved, breathed, danced. Here's where it gets stranger. Some of the masks bear stylistic resemblance to Mesoamerican iconography, especially the rain god Tlaloc, with his goggle eyes and fanged mouth, and the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. This has led to speculation about long-distance cultural connections, trade routes, or shared mythological structures spanning from central Mexico into the borderlands of Texas. But correlation isn't causation, and Hueco Tanks doesn't give up its secrets easily. The masks exist in layers, painted over older images in some places, defaced or faded in others. They suggest not just ritual, but evolution, belief systems changing, being rewritten, forgotten, then remembered, a spiritual palimpsest in stone. And then there's the question of access. Many of the most powerful masks are located in hard-to-reach spots, inside tight chambers, under ledges, above steep climbs. They weren't meant to be seen by everyone. Or perhaps they were only meant to be seen at specific times, dawnlight filtering in just so, or moonlight catching a shimmer of red pigment. Today, Hueco Tanks is protected, but the faces remain, watching, not asking for interpretation, not offering it. What's certain is this: the people who painted these masks didn't live in a symbolic vacuum. They interacted with the land, with each other, and with distant groups. Their pigments came from somewhere. Their ideas traveled, and sometimes what traveled wasn't stone or paint, but something much sharper, something that shattered, sparked, and shaped prehistoric economies: flint. Which brings us to the Texas Panhandle, and the ancient quarries of Alibates, where beauty and utility collided in a single stone. And the question wasn't what it was, but who controlled it. Who controlled Alibates flint? Out in the Texas Panhandle, where the grassland ripples like a sleeping animal's breath and the wind never quite says what it means, there's a hillside dotted with shallow pits and stone debris. It doesn't look like much, but 13,000 years ago, this unassuming patch of land near the Canadian River was a place of fire, flint, and silent transactions, a prehistoric quarry site that may have powered entire trade networks. This is the Alibates flint quarries, and the mystery isn't just how the stone got there or how it was used, but who got to decide who used it. Alibates flint, technically agatized dolomite, is unlike most materials in the region. It's hard, fine-grained, and brilliantly colored in reds, blues, purples, and creamy whites. If you're going to make a stone tool, this stuff is elite, and prehistoric people knew it. Clovis points made from Alibates flint have been found hundreds of miles away in Colorado, Kansas, even as far as the Mississippi River. That's not normal travel range. That's a signal, a beacon of value. The quarries themselves, over 700 of them, dot the tops of hills overlooking the river valley. They're shallow, rarely more than a meter deep, but they're dense. Dense with flakes, cores, hammerstones. People didn't just pass through here. They worked here, systematically, generationally. So who were they? That's the hard part. Alibates has been used by a lot of different groups across thousands of years. There's evidence of Clovis-era occupation, fulsome activity, and later archaic and ceramic period usage. It wasn't a single culture's territory, it was a kind of long-term commons, or so we assume. But flint isn't just a rock, it's a resource, and valuable resources attract rules formal or informal. That's where the mystery kicks in. What were the social mechanics behind access to this site? Did early Paleo-Indian groups claim exclusive rights to certain pits? Did outsiders trade for finished tools or unworked nodules? Was there a seasonal rhythm to extraction, tied to migration cycles? Or was the site a neutral zone, a kind of prehistoric Switzerland where anyone could gather what they needed, provided they followed certain rituals or customs? We don't know. There are no settlement structures at the quarries, no obvious signs of defensive features or permanent habitation. That could suggest neutral access. But the high quality of the stone and its broad distribution implies some form of regulation. It's hard to believe that one of the most important toolstone sources in North America operated entirely on the honor system. Then there's the issue of production. Some researchers believe Alibates flint was preformed into blanks at the quarry and finished elsewhere. That would make sense. Carry the lightest, most versatile form of the stone, and finish shaping it when you need it. But others argue that complete tools were made on-site and traded outward. If so, someone or some group was managing that flow, possibly even specializing in it. Which brings up an uncomfortable possibility: economic hierarchy. We like to think of early hunter-gatherers as egalitarian bands, sharing resources and decisions. But what if that wasn't always the case? What if control over Alibates flint conferred power? What if some groups acted more like merchant guilds than wandering families? And what if that control wasn't peaceful? The lack of visible conflict at the site doesn't rule out social pressure, ritual enforcement, or alliances that governed who got access. We just don't have the paperwork. We have the pits, the flakes, the tools scattered across the continent, and the implication that someone was in charge. But like most things in prehistoric Texas, that control wasn't permanent. The people shifted, the climate changed, and Alibates faded not in importance, but in clarity. We can still see the quarry. We just can't see the hands that once held it. And speaking of hands and homes, there's another Texas site where the mystery isn't what was made or what was traded, but who lived there, and when, and why they chose to leave so little behind. A place of circular impressions in the desert stone. A camp that doesn't quite behave like one. A gathering that left rings but not answers. Teepee and Wikiup rings in the Trans-Pecos, southwest of the Pecos River, where the Trans-Pecos meets the sky in a long, lean hush, sits a low hill known as Squatiet Peak or Tunis Peak, depending on who you ask. It rises unceremoniously from the desert floor, bare and weather-beaten, with a sweeping view of the surrounding basin. The landscape here is harsh, dry, and deeply quiet. And scattered across the slopes and surrounding flats are dozens, maybe hundreds of stone circles. They don't announce themselves. You have to walk carefully to see them. Low rings of unshaped rock, each about 3 to 5 meters across, spaced irregularly, like ghostly footprints of a vanished gathering. Archaeologists call them teepee or wikiup rings, the stone anchors used to hold down conical brush shelters in the wind. But that explanation, while plausible, doesn't really explain why they're here in such numbers, or who camped in this place so often, for so long. The problem isn't evidence, it's the absence of it. There's very little cultural material associated with these rings, few artifacts, almost no hearths, no post holes, trash pits, or signs of prolonged occupation. Some rings have fire-cracked rock nearby. Others are completely clean. It's like people showed up, stayed for a few nights, and left again and again without leaving much behind. Except the rings. So, what kind of gathering behaves that way? One theory holds that this was a seasonal aggregation site, a place where mobile groups came together during specific times of year, perhaps for trade, ritual, or marriage alliances. The lack of debris might reflect the nature of these gatherings: temporary, ceremonial, not domestic. Another theory suggests that Squatite Peak held spiritual significance. Its prominence in the landscape makes it a natural landmark. Maybe people didn't camp because of the geography, but because of what it symbolized: a point of orientation, a place for rites, for vision quests, for connecting with whatever passed for the divine. Still, others argue for a strategic explanation. The peak gives wide visibility across the desert. That makes it a good lookout, maybe even a defensive position. Temporary camps, placed with caution. But if that's the case, the scarcity of projectile points is hard to square. Then there's the sheer scale. Squat at Peak isn't unique, but it is unusually rich in rings. Some researchers have suggested that these sites may have been reused over thousands of years. That would explain the density and the mystery. If each group left a few rings per generation, the landscape would slowly fill with them, without ever having been truly settled. But what kind of cultural continuity would that require? And who were these people? The Trans-Pecos region doesn't give up many names. The groups that lived here left few written records and fewer oral histories that survive today. They may have been ancestral to later Jornada-Mogollon cultures, or completely separate. Some ring sites have yielded archaic period tools, others, nothing datable at all. So we're left with this: stone rings in the desert, like punctuation marks without sentences. They speak of presence, but not identity, of repetition, but not narrative. And just beyond this quiet mystery lies another kind of ring, not circular, but layered, not shelters, but middens, trash heaps, and not casual camps, but places where people gathered in such numbers and cooked in such volume that they left behind mountains of burned rock. A different kind of gathering, a different kind of mystery. One that smells of smoke, baked agave, and something we still don't fully understand. Gulf Coast shell middens. The Texas coast is a shifting creature, part memory, part mudflat, part monument to storms that rearranged everything except the mystery. If you walk along the shoreline near Galveston, Matagorda Bay, or farther south near Corpus Christi, you'll find what look like gentle, rolling hills tucked into the saltgrass. But they're not hills. They're middens, ancient trash heaps, built not of dirt but of shell, mountains of Rangia clam, layer upon layer, packed tightly like a geological ledger of prehistoric appetite. Some of these shell middens are massive, stretching for hundreds of meters, standing meters tall. They weren't casual dump sites. They were built up over generations, sometimes centuries, by people who came to the coast, harvested the bounty of the estuaries, and left behind the residue of their feasting. But were they temporary visitors, permanent residents, or something in between? That's the mystery. Shell middens show up in many coastal societies. They're found in Japan, Scandinavia, South America. But the Texas Gulf Coast middens are unique in their size, composition, and ambiguity. Some contain little more than shell, interspersed with fish bones, charcoal, and the occasional fragment of pottery or bone tool. Others are more diverse, with buried hearths, post holes, even human remains. The standard interpretation is that these were seasonal camps, places people visited during the cooler months when the bugs were fewer and the clams were fat. The shellfish harvest could be intense, feeding dozens of people for weeks. When the heat returned, the groups moved inland. Simple. But then, some of the middens look like villages. They have structure, repetition, hearths carefully placed in layers, consistent reuse of the same spots. Some middens appear to have house pads, flat areas cleared of shell, perhaps for brush huts or thatched shelters. That raises the question, were these sites occupied year-round? Or did people return to the same location every season for centuries, treating it as a kind of sacred home base? Researchers have debated this for decades. Radiocarbon dating shows long spans of use. But there's little in the way of architecture, permanent features, or deep storage pits, the kinds of things you'd expect in a true sedentary settlement. Still, the sheer labor involved in building up some of these middens suggests continuity and investment. One possibility: semi-sedentism groups who stayed put for much of the year, moving only short distances based on weather and resources. That would make them neither fully nomadic nor fully settled. It would also fit with the archaeological evidence: continuity without permanence. Another question lingers in the chemical signatures. Some clamshells show evidence of repeated exposure to heat. Others seem unburned. Some middens contain only one kind of shell. Others, a mix. Were people experimenting? Using different techniques for different species? Or were these culinary choices bound to ritual, only cooking rangia one way, only gathering during certain tides? The middens also carry clues about climate. Layers of storm-blown sand, changes in species distribution, shifts in the ratio of saltwater to freshwater shellfish, all tell a story of a changing coastline, a people adapting constantly to the rhythm of sea and sky. But there's something else too, a sense that these places meant more than survival. Some middens contain human burials, carefully placed, sometimes within the mound itself, sometimes beside it. That's not random. That's reverence. That's making a shell heap into a memory. So what were these sites? Kitchens? Cemeteries? Gathering places? Sacred landscapes? The answer is probably yes, all of the above, and none of it tidy. Because just as the tide doesn't move in straight lines, neither did prehistoric life on the Texas coast. It curved, receded, returned, and what it left behind wasn't just waste. It was a record of gathering, feeding, being, and being together. But for truly massive gatherings, you have to head inland into the hill country, where the land is rock and the ovens were fire pits the size of bedrooms, where people didn't just eat, they cooked for days, whole plants, whole communities, and they left behind donut-shaped monuments of shattered stone, still radiating heat from another era. Burned rock middens, Texas. Mega ovens. In the scrubland and limestone uplands of central Texas, scattered across ranches and river valleys, there are formations that look like broken altars or primitive kilns, low mounds of fractured rock, often arranged in rough rings or domes, sometimes dozens of feet across. These are burned rock middens, and they aren't ruins. They're recipes, left out in the open for thousands of years. At first glance, they resemble debris piles, fire-cracked stones heaped in strange configurations. But look closer, and you begin to see the logic. At the center of many is a pit or several where heated rocks were used to bake starchy desert plants like sodal, lechuguilla, and agave. These weren't snacks, they were survival strategies. And not for individuals, for crowds. The process was slow, but efficient. Dig a pit, fill it with wood, pile on rocks, light the fire. Once the rocks were glowing hot, they'd be covered with layers of green plants and then capped with soil. The heat would break down the toxic compounds and tough fibers in the plant hearts, converting them into digestible, slightly sweet pulp. But here's the kicker: it could take 2 to 3 days. That's not a solo project. That's a community event. The scale of these middens suggests large gatherings, dozens, possibly hundreds of people coming together to process and store high-calorie food that could be dried and packed for long treks or lean seasons. In a land with no agriculture, no domesticated animals, this was cooking at its most strategic. And the middens are everywhere. Central Texas has tens of thousands of them. Some cover entire hillsides, spreading out like fossilized cookouts. Others are isolated, silent monuments to past gatherings. Many are dated to the late Archaic period, roughly 4,000 to 1,000 years ago, though the practice likely began earlier. Why the explosion of these features during that window? One theory ties it to climate. As the environment became drier and more variable, High-yield plant processing became critical. Agave and lechuguilla are dependable. They grow in poor soils, survive droughts, and store energy well. But they're also tough and mildly toxic raw. Earth oven cooking made them viable. Another theory links it to social complexity. The coordinated labor, site reuse, and food surplus suggests something beyond small family bands. Some middens seem to be focal points in broader landscapes linked to trails, water sources, or ceremonial features. Maybe they were seasonal meeting places. Maybe they were ancestral mega kitchens where lineages returned to reassert identity through food and fire. Still, questions persist. Why are some middens massive while others nearby are small? Was that a reflection of group size, status? Were some reserved for ritual use? And what does it mean that so many show signs of multiple reuses over centuries? And then there's the cultural meaning. Cooking, in every human society, is never just about calories. It's about who cooks, how they do it, who gets to eat first. Was the pit the center of a hierarchy? A rite of passage? A calendar event? The truth is, we don't know. All we have are stones, cracked, scorched, tossed aside, and yet even these carry memory. The broken ring of rock is a frozen moment. Someone waited here, tending a fire, watching steam rise from the soil, waiting for a plant to become food. It's a quiet kind of mystery. Not dramatic, not violent, but strangely haunting. Because every one of those stones was placed by hand, heated, used, discarded. And the mounds they left behind weren't garbage. They were intentional, chosen, built, rebuilt. And yet, not all the rocks are still there. In some places, midden fields are stripped, looted, vanished. Where did they go? And what does their absence say about the people who used them or the ones who came after? Because the next mystery isn't about fire or food. It's about disappearance. Not of people, not of plants, but of the rocks themselves. Where did all the earth oven rocks go? In parts of Texas where the burned rock middens once stood in dense, oven field clusters now, there's emptiness, gaps in the archaeological map, acres of land where early maps and rancher accounts recalled mounds of fire-cracked stone, but now, just flat grass, or cultivated fields, or barren soil with no trace of the massive cooking infrastructure that should be there. It's not just anecdotal. Some of the most productive zones for hot rock earth oven technology, such as the Llano Uplift, the Balcones Escarpment, and even parts of the Edwards Plateau, seem to have middens with incomplete or uneven rock deposits. Some ovens appear hastily dismantled, others are completely erased. So where did all the rocks go? That's not a metaphor. It's a literal question. A midden can contain tons, literally tons of fire-cracked rock. These were reused over and over until they broke down into unusable shards. And then they were tossed to the side, forming the characteristic crescent or donut-shaped piles. They should still be there. But in many cases, they aren't mages. One answer might be erosion, wind, and water slowly wearing the features down. That certainly accounts for some loss. Over a few thousand years, it wouldn't be surprising for loose piles of limestone or sandstone to get swept away or reburied. But erosion doesn't remove all trace. It smears the evidence. It doesn't scrub the site clean. Another possibility is cultural recycling. Later groups, encountering these massive rock piles, may have repurposed the material. Rocks are useful. After all, for building cairns, lining paths, weighing down thatch roofs, or reinforcing water channels. Especially in regions where suitable cobbles are scarce, scavenging from an old midden would make sense. The irony, of course, is that the remains of one culture's cuisine may have become another's construction material. But the most intriguing possibility is that the rocks didn't just go somewhere. They were deliberately taken away, cleared, moved, buried, for reasons we don't fully understand. In some experimental archaeology projects, researchers discovered that clearing out spent earth oven rocks was essential to reuse the space. The mounds couldn't grow indefinitely, they'd become too cumbersome. So communities periodically scraped them out, pushed them into gullies, or used them to fill in abandoned oven pits. That means the life cycle of a midden wasn't just build, use, abandon. It was build, use, adapt, erase. That reframes the question. Maybe the mystery isn't where the rocks went. Maybe it's why the memory of their absence matters. Because what the vanishing rocks reveal is a behavioral choice, a pattern, a strategy of cleanliness, mobility, or even ritual closure. In some indigenous traditions around the world, cooking spaces are considered spiritually potent. Once used, they must be closed properly, covered, purified, hidden. Is that what was happening in prehistoric Texas? Or could the removal reflect a deeper economic rhythm, a pattern of site lifespan where camps were designed for short bursts of heavy use and then intentionally cleared for the next group? It's almost industrial in logic, rotating hotspots of production, always shifting, always making room for the next cycle. But there's another, more recent layer to the mystery. In many parts of Texas, the rocks didn't vanish thousands of years ago. They were hauled off in the last 100. Ranchers and homesteaders, unfamiliar with the archaeological significance of the mounds, cleared them to plant crops, pasture, livestock, or build roads. In some cases, they were carted away to serve as fill for driveways or foundations, and with them went thousands of years of stratified data, not just rocks, but the charcoal, bone, and ash trapped within. In that sense, the story of the missing rocks is the story of archaeological vulnerability, a reminder that the most mundane elements of ancient life, the kitchen waste, the overcooked stones, the discarded lechugia cores, often carry the most meaning. And once they're gone, the story gets quieter. But even the rocks that did remain are still difficult to read, because while we can date their last fire, we rarely know when the oven started or how cooking techniques evolved. That's the next mystery. Not the rocks themselves, but the moment they turned hot. The why, when, and how of the first time someone decided to throw a plant into a pit and wait for transformation. Early bulb baking chronology. Somewhere around 9,000 years ago, deep in the early Archaic period, the people of Central and West Texas did something quietly revolutionary. They started baking plants not casually, but systematically. Before agriculture, before pottery, before most signs of settlement, they built earth ovens and started transforming the inedible into food. We know this because of burned rock middens and the charred remnants of plant hearts, sotol, agave, lechuguilla, and bulbs of desert lily. And the radiocarbon dates don't lie. Around this time, earth oven cooking explodes across the archaeological record. What changed? The earliest foragers in Texas, such as the Paleo-Indians, focused heavily on mobile hunting. Their toolkits revolved around projectile points. Their camps were light. Their diet leaned toward meat. But by the early Archaic, things shifted. The megafauna were gone. The landscape was drying. And in the absence of big game, people turned to a more reliable resource: plants. Not just gathering seeds or fruits, but turning tough, fibrous, even toxic plant parts into digestible calories through controlled fire and time. That's where the ovens come in. This transition marks one of the most significant dietary adaptations in prehistoric Texas. The decision to dig a pit, heat rocks, bury a bulb, and wait 2 days for it to cook is not something you do on a whim. It's a learned behavior. It requires knowledge of plant toxicity, cooking chemistry, fuel needs, and seasonality. So how did this knowledge emerge? One hypothesis is climate-driven innovation. As rainfall patterns shifted and large game grew scarce, people experimented. Plants that had once been backup food starvation fare became staples. And once people realized that fire could unlock the sugars and starches in tough plant tissues, a new food economy emerged. Another possibility is cultural diffusion, that these cooking techniques spread from groups to the north or south, carried by seasonal gatherings or slow migration. But the dating suggests a relatively rapid and independent emergence across several regions of Texas. Whatever its origin, the bulb-baking innovation reshaped the landscape. Some archaeologists refer to this period as the beginning of intensive foraging in Texas. People weren't just reacting to scarcity, they were optimizing, investing labor in long-term food processing, creating reusable kitchen complexes, coordinating group cooking events. In short, they were becoming more complex, not in their tools, necessarily, but in their social and subsistence strategies. What's strange is how little of this revolution left behind formal structures. No temples, no storage granaries, no written instructions, just stones and char. But those clues are enough to show that by 9,000 years ago, prehistoric Texans were engaging in plant processing with an intensity that rivals early farmers. And that leads to the moral irony. Before they planted crops, they engineered food systems. Before they stayed in one place, they built the infrastructure to cook for 100. The ovens outlived the recipes. The stones outlasted the storytellers. And the people who mastered this technology didn't just use it to eat. Sometimes they used it near the dead, deep inside sinkholes, vertical chambers where the remains of generations rest, carried down, placed carefully, alongside items that should not have been local. Objects from distant coasts, grave goods that suggest belief and memory ran far beyond the next meal. Bearing Sinkhole Mortuary. Logic. In the heart of the Texas Hill Country, where limestone ridges fold into quiet valleys and the creeks run only when they feel like it, there is a vertical shaft in the earth that descends more than 30 feet. It is not wide. It is not inviting. But for over 5,000 years, people lowered their dead into it. This is Bearing Sinkhole, a natural limestone feature near Kerrville that served as a mortuary site for generations of archaic peoples. Not a cave, not a shelter, a vertical shaft. A place where the living stood at the edge of darkness and deliberately deposited their dead into the earth. Again and again, for centuries. And we still don't understand why. The Bearing Sinkhole site is one of the most extensive mortuary deposits in prehistoric Texas. Excavations in the 1982nd revealed the remains of over 60 individuals, dating from approximately 5,000 to 1,000 years ago. The skeletons were not dumped, they were placed. Some were whole, some were partial, some bore signs of careful preparation, bundle burials, tightly arranged bones. Others were less tidy but still deliberate. Alongside the human remains, archaeologists found grave goods artifacts that shouldn't have been there, at least not naturally. Items like shell beads from the Gulf Coast, marine shell pendants, exotic stones, items that had to be carried in from long distances, traded or transported with intent. These were not casual tokens, they were messages. But what was the message? One theory is cosmological, that the sinkhole represented a passage, a symbolic journey into the underworld. In many indigenous traditions across the Americas, caves and vertical openings in the earth are seen as portals between realms, entrances to the spirit world, or to the womb of the earth where ancestors reside. If that belief was present here, then Bearing Sinkhole wasn't just a grave, it was a boundary. That would explain the consistency. Over 5,000 years of repeated use, with no evidence of habitation or domestic activity at the site. No hearths, no food debris, no camps, just the dead. Another possibility is logistical. The hill country is full of limestone features, caves, cracks, collapses. Maybe this one was simply accessible, deep enough to discourage scavengers, and just remote enough to serve as a sacred neutral zone. But if it were purely practical, why the grave goods? Why the care? And then there's the unsettling detail. Some of the remains appear to have been moved, reorganized, or added to later. Bones rearranged, bundles inserted into older layers. Was this reverence? Reuse? Ritual engagement with the ancestors? It's difficult to say. What we do know is that the pattern holds across the region. Bearing is not unique, just unusually well preserved. Other sinkholes and shelters show similar signs: vertical deposition, repeated use, and long chronological spans, which raises the question, was there a broader hill country mortuary tradition? And if so, what governed its logic? It wasn't random. The dead weren't just put somewhere out of sight. They were placed in liminal spaces between light and dark, between the open air and the belly of the earth. And the objects they were buried with suggest networks of trade and symbolic meaning that stretched far beyond the hill country. Perhaps this is the deepest message of Bering Sinkhole, that for these people, death wasn't an ending, but a movement, a descent, a return. And they marked it not with tombs or monuments, but with careful placement in a space the earth itself had opened. But not all records of daily life in prehistoric Texas were left with the dead. Some were left with the living, or, more precisely, left by the living, intimately, repeatedly, in latrines. And in one cave, these personal remnants didn't disappear. They dried, they hardened, and they told stories about what people ate, how they moved, and what it meant to live in rhythm with the land. Hines Cave latrines. What do coprolites reveal? If prehistoric Texas had a diary, it would be in Hines Cave, written not in ink, but in fossilized waste. Tucked into the lower Pecos Canyonlands near the Pecos River, Hines Cave is a dry rock shelter with an extraordinary preservation record. For thousands of years, small groups of hunter-gatherers lived here seasonally, using the shelter for sleeping, eating, crafting, and, importantly, relieving themselves. And because the cave is dry, very dry, their waste didn't decay. It desiccated, hardened, and it stayed. Archaeologists refer to these relics as coprolites fossilized human feces. Hundreds of them have been excavated at Hines Cave, making it one of the most important paleodietary sites in North America. If that sounds unappetizing, consider this. From these ancient latrines, we can reconstruct seasonal migration, food processing techniques, health conditions, and even gut biome history. It's not pretty, but it's precise. What the coprolites reveal is remarkable. These people weren't just eating wild seeds and berries, they were practicing advanced plant processing. Some coprolites contain finely ground seeds, suggesting that foods were being roasted, ground, sifted, and turned into cakes or gruels. Others include remnants of desert succulents like prickly pear and lechuguilla, confirming the hot rock cooking techniques evidenced by burned rock middens elsewhere in the region. Even more surprising, variation. Some coprolites contain fish bones, small mammals, or lizard scales. Others are nearly vegetarian. This indicates a flexible diet, responsive to seasonal availability and group preference. It also suggests mobility. Groups didn't just stay put, they moved with the resources. But coprolites don't just preserve food. They preserve parasites, and pollen, and fibers, in some cases DNA. From these fragile time capsules, scientists can track health patterns, evidence of intestinal parasites, seasonal nutritional stress, or digestive adaptation to high-fiber diets. We even see signs of food being recooked. Partially digested seeds suggest that some plant materials were consumed more than once, perhaps regurgitated or recycled in cooking. That's not a mistake. That's resourcefulness. Hines Cave also offers clues about social behavior. The placement of latrine areas suggests spatial organization within the shelter private zones, communal areas, maybe even gendered use. When combined with hearth placement, storage pits, and artifact distribution, the coprolites become more than evidence of digestion, they're evidence of living systems. and they raise philosophical questions. These people left no written language, no permanent structures, no grand monuments. But they left behind an unbroken chain of bodily knowledge, information that only the driest of climates and the slowest of archaeologists could recover. In that sense, Hines Cave is both humbling and profound. It reminds us that what we flush away without a second thought might one day be the clearest window into how we lived. And yet, all of this, the cooking, the moving, the dying, eventually changed. In East Texas, a different society emerged. Agricultural, mound building, ceremonially complex. The Caddo. And at one site in particular, their story takes a strange turn, not in how they lived, but in how and why they walked away. Why the Caddo left the George C. Davis Caddo Mound Center, tucked into the piney woods of East Texas, along the banks of the Neches River, sits a small hill that doesn't belong to the landscape. It's symmetrical, deliberate, man-made. At first glance, it looks like a low, grassy rise, but dig into the soil, and you'll find layers of earth carried by hand, basket after basket, centuries ago. This is the George C. Davis site, also known as Caddo Mounds, once home to a thriving ceremonial center built by ancestors of the Caddo people. And then suddenly, sometime in the 13th or 14th century, they walked away. No war, no evidence of mass death, no widespread burning, just silence. The platform mound was capped, the ceremonial buildings dismantled or abandoned, and for all the effort that went into building this monumental landscape, no one ever came back to finish the story. The Davis site was once the westernmost expression of the Mississippian world, a far-reaching, mound-building civilization that flourished across the southeastern U.S. between 800 and 1600 CE. It wasn't a city, exactly, but a political and religious hub, a place where people gathered to bury their elite, mark celestial events, and reaffirm their social order. At its height, Davis featured multiple mounds, including a large platform mound likely topped with a structure for elite ritual or governance, and a lower burial mound containing the dead and their grave goods. A sprawling village spread around the ceremonial core, with dwellings, storage pits, gardens, and evidence of trade networks stretching to the Gulf Coast, the Arkansas River Valley, and beyond. The ceramics are unmistakably Caddo and finely incised, tempered with care, often bearing patterns that seem more like signatures than decoration. The architectural layout is aligned with solar and cardinal directions, not by accident, but by cosmological design. This was a society in tune with the land, the sky, and the cycles that governed both. So why did they leave? That's the question scholars have been asking for decades. There is no single, clear answer, only a patchwork of theories, each one plausible, none entirely satisfying. The most obvious suspect is climate. Around the time Davis was abandoned, the region was entering the early stages of what would become the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that disrupted rainfall patterns, shortened growing seasons, and stressed agricultural systems. The Caddo, like many Mississippian peoples, relied heavily on maize agriculture. If the climate became erratic, crop yields could have plummeted, making ceremonial centers like Davis harder to sustain. But climate stress alone rarely explains full abandonment. People adapt, they shift strategies, they downsize. The Davis community didn't appear to gradually fade. It appears to have chosen to leave, decisively. That raises the possibility of internal political change. Some archaeologists argue that the Caddo social structure, which was hierarchical and based on ritual authority, may have fractured. If elite lineages lost legitimacy due to failed harvests, misinterpreted omens, or power struggles, the community could have lost faith in the ceremonial core. And if the power that once held the village together became contested or irrelevant, the people may have dispersed into smaller, kin-based units elsewhere in the region. Another possibility lies in cosmology. The mounds at Davis weren't just buildings, they were cosmic anchors, symbolizing the connection between the people, the ancestors, the sky, and the underworld. If a major astronomical or calendrical event occurred, an eclipse, a comet, a failure of prophecy, it might have been interpreted as a sign that the sacred landscape had fulfilled its purpose, or worse, had become spiritually dangerous. In that framework, capping the mound and walking away would have been not failure, but fulfillment. Then there's the archaeological wildcard: contact without conquest. Long before Spanish explorers arrived in force, news of them traveled. Stories of strangers to the east, armed and armored, would have moved through trade routes long before Europeans physically arrived. Some archaeologists believe that rumors of the Spanish or the disease waves that may have preceded them could have triggered population shifts and ritual abandonment far ahead of direct contact. It's possible that the people who left Davis weren't defeated. They were adapting, leaving before something worse arrived, rewriting their own narrative before someone else wrote it for them. But the truth is, the abandonment of the Davis site may never be fully explained. It resists the simplicity of collapse. It feels more like a quiet refusal, a turning inward, a cultural decision to stop building up and start moving out. And that silence speaks volumes, because even as they left, they didn't erase what they built. The mounds still stand, the pottery still tells, the trade beads still glint in the soil, and what's left isn't ruin, it's restraint. A society choosing not to overstay its welcome in a sacred space that had run its course. But if the departure from Davis was quiet, the logic behind how the mounds themselves were used is even quieter, because the next mystery isn't about absence, it's about roles. Why build one mound for ceremony and another for burial? And what happened on the stage of Earth before the final curtain came down? Function of Caddo platform versus burial mounds. At Davis. At the George C. Davis site, or Caddo Mounds, as it's more widely known, the land doesn't just hold the remains of a settlement. It holds a conversation between the living and the dead. And that conversation was structured, literally, by dirt. Two mounds define the ceremonial heart of the site: the platform mound and the burial mound. Both are human-made. Both required massive communal effort, thousands of baskets of soil hauled, stacked, leveled. But while their architecture is similar, their purpose wasn't, or at least, we don't think it was. That's the mystery. The platform mound rises above the landscape with deliberate symmetry. It's flat-topped, about 15 feet high, with broad terraced sides. Evidence suggests it once supported a structure, possibly a temple, a council house, or the residence of a ritual leader. Postholes indicate that buildings were rebuilt multiple times atop the mound, each iteration layered atop the last like sedimented authority. This was, archaeologists believe, the realm of the living elite, where ceremonies were held, decisions made, maybe even performances enacted for an assembled public. It was not casual, it was central, and it was seen. In contrast, the nearby burial mound was not built for the living, but for the dead specifically, for high-status individuals. Within it, archaeologists found graves lined with cedar, accompanied by grave goods like finely incised ceramics, shell ornaments, and polished stone tools. These burials were not simple. They were curated, and their placement suggests an ideology of ancestral veneration, a belief that the dead retained power, and that power could be maintained or accessed by controlling where, how, and with whom they were buried. So you have two mounds, two hills of meaning, one for presence, one for absence, one where a leader might speak, one where a leader's silence might be louder than speech. But the problem is, we don't know exactly how these two spheres interacted. There are no texts. No oral traditions from this specific site survive in a complete form. What we have are patterns, alignments, artifacts, stratigraphy, and from those, we can only infer. For instance, the platform mound's orientation is not random, It's aligned to cardinal directions, possibly solar events, solstices, equinoxes. That suggests cosmological intent. The people on the mound weren't just managing society, they were managing cosmic order. Did rituals performed on the mound correspond with burials in the other? Was there a sequence, a death, followed by a public performance, followed by an interment? Or were these spaces entirely distinct, separated by taboo or ideology? Another possibility is performative contrast. The platform mound was where the leader was seen. The burial mound was where the leader became invisible. In that light, the burial mound becomes not just a cemetery, but a place of transformation from person to ancestor, from voice to legacy. There's also the question of access. Not everyone went up the platform mound. That seems clear. Its height and the structural remains suggest restricted use of stage with few actors. Meanwhile, the burial mound appears similarly exclusive. Most people at the Davis site were likely buried elsewhere. This mound was reserved. So where did most people go? And what does that say about hierarchy? If the mounds reflect status both in life and death, then they also reflect a social map, a world divided not just by wealth or bloodline, but by cosmic roles. The elite didn't just live differently, they died differently. Their bones were placed in the landscape in ways meant to shape how others lived. And then there's the strangest possibility, that the mounds weren't strictly divided, that what we call the platform and burial functions were more fluid. In some Mississippian cultures, burial mounds were built from the remains of old platform mounds, dismantling the homes of the living elite to house their bodies. In that scenario, the platform becomes the burial, and the act of transformation is architectural. At the Davis site, we don't have conclusive evidence of that, but we do have sequence. The burial mound appears to have gone out of use before the platform mound. That's unusual. Most cultures honor the dead long after they stop building new ceremonial centers. Here, it's reversed. Why? Did the society shift from ancestor-based leadership to a more immediate, living theocracy? Did belief systems change? Was there a schism between clans, a change in cosmology, a decision to stop burying in the mound either as rebellion, reform, or necessity? We don't know. What we do know is that the mounds weren't static. They were used, filled, capped, built over, altered, and when the site was finally abandoned, the platform mound was deliberately sealed, capped with a layer of clean soil, made inaccessible. That implies a closing ritual, not a collapse, but a decision to finish. In that sense, the Davis mounds aren't just monuments, they're arguments about life, death, memory, and legitimacy. And that argument doesn't end here, because to the northwest, in the dusty plains of the Panhandle, another site preserves a much longer, deeper story, not of mounds, but of mud, of animals, of fire, of ancient water flowing over bones. A site where the timeline stretches so far back, it bends. Lubbock Lake's long layered story. In the broad, flat expanse of the southern high plains, where the wind pulls dust into spirals and even the horizon feels like it might evaporate, there's a place where time has refused to move on. Not because it's frozen, quite the opposite. It's because everything happened there, again and again, across nearly 12,000 years of human history. This place is Lubbock Lake, a dry channel today, but once a flowing water source and a kind of prehistoric attractor. It didn't look like much, just a modest spring-fed stream cutting through the Llano Estacado, but to people of every era, it was a magnet. Hunters, gatherers, foragers, settlers, they all came here and left things behind. That's what makes the Lubbock Lake Landmark Site one of the most important and most haunting archaeological zones in Texas, because its sediment layers don't just contain artifacts, they contain episodes: occupation, abandonment, reoccupation, times of plenty, times of absence, a staccato rhythm of human presence carved into silt and loam. The site was first exposed in the 1932 during the digging of a municipal lake channel, hence the name. But what they found under the surface was unexpected: ancient animal bones, stone tools, and signs of fire. What began as a civil project quickly morphed into an archaeological goldmine. Since then, stratigraphic excavation has revealed over 12 vertical feet of history, from Paleo-Indian bison hunts to archaic campsites to more recent protohistoric occupations. Each layer is a world unto itself. But together, they tell a bigger story of people adjusting, reacting, surviving, always returning to the same modest waterway. One of the site's most striking features is the episodic nature of its use. There's not a continuous occupation here. Instead, we see pulses, short-term encampments, separated by centuries of silence. The reasons are still being modeled, but they likely tie into shifting hydrology and climate. When the springs flowed, the site was lush and full of game. When they dried, the people vanished. But it's not just the environment that changed, it's how people used the space. In the earliest levels, dated to around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, we find evidence of organized bison hunting. Not just random kills, but coordinated processing. Bones stacked, marrow extracted, hides likely prepared. These weren't casual foragers, they were specialists, exploiting the landscape efficiently. Then, later, we see a shift to broader subsistence. Seed grinding, plant roasting, less reliance on big game, smaller, more diversified toolkits. It's not a collapse, it's an adaptation. By the time we reach the late archaic layers, around 3,000 to 1,000 years ago, Lubbock Lake seems to function more like a seasonal stopover. Hearths, middens, and burned rock suggest recurring visits, maybe during predictable weather cycles or plant harvest seasons. Still transient, still tactical, but deeply familiar. What's most puzzling is the pattern. Why return to the same place over thousands of years if it wasn't permanently reliable? Was it memory? Was it tradition? Or was it something less tangible, a sense of place passed down orally across generations, marking the land as meaningful even when the springs went dry? Some researchers believe Lubbock Lake became part of a broader cognitive map, a place known across group boundaries, tied into social networks and seasonal rounds, a site not just of subsistence, but of identity. And yet, despite its importance, the archaeological record here is curiously quiet in certain ways. There are no monumental structures, no burial mounds, no ornate rock art. Just flakes, bones, and hearths repeated, simple, efficient. It's almost as if the people who came here didn't want to make a statement. They just wanted to exist, for a moment, in a place that still remembered them. That subtlety is its own kind of mystery. Because if Lubbock Lake was merely utilitarian, we wouldn't expect the longevity of its use. It wouldn't draw people back after droughts, or after centuries of disuse. But it does. It always has. Even today, the site continues to reveal new layers, not just artifacts, but environmental data, pollen cores, microfaunal remains. Each new trench opens a window into a time most people forget even happened. And that brings us to one of the most quietly radical aspects of Lubbock Lake, its early adoption of radiocarbon dating in Paleo-Indian contexts. At a time when dating techniques were still emerging, this site became one of the first to anchor those techniques to actual events, actual occupations, actual bones. In a way, Lubbock Lake doesn't just preserve history, it calibrated it. And what it helped reveal next would send a tremor through Paleo-Indian studies, a date so early and so direct, it forced a reconsideration of what early occupation in the Americas actually meant. Earliest radiocarbon from a Paleo-Indian context. Here, radiocarbon dating, like so many tools in archaeology, seems deceptively simple now, a scientific stopwatch for deep time. Measure the decay of carbon 14-inch organic material, and voila, the past lines up in a row. But back in the mid-20th century, this was a revolutionary idea still under scrutiny. And nowhere in Texas did it find a more pivotal test than at Lubbock Lake. It wasn't just that Lubbock Lake held Paleo-Indian materials. That much was already suspected. It was that it offered a rare combination of deeply stratified layers, preserved organic matter, and a stable sedimentary environment. In short, the perfect test case for a method that was about to reshape the human timeline in North America. In the late 1952 and early 1962, archaeologists working the Lubbock Lake site sent charcoal samples from Paleo-Indian levels, specifically the stratum associated with bison kill and butchery events, to the emerging carbon-14 labs. The results were stunning. Dates stretching back over 11,000 years, placing human occupation firmly within the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. These weren't ambiguous flakes or possible hearths either. The context was clear: butchered bison bones, clustered tools, fire-cracked rock, and charcoal from burned features, all locked within undisturbed sediments. It was one of the first times that direct evidence of human activity could be tied to a radiometrically confirmed time frame, and it helped cement the credibility of the entire radiocarbon enterprise in American archaeology. But with that credibility came complication. Because once you accept the date, you also accept what it implies. That by 11,200 years ago, or possibly earlier, humans weren't just present in Texas. They were already seasoned players in its ecological game, skilled hunters, pattern followers, possibly even site returners. Which begs the uncomfortable question: how much earlier did they really arrive? The radiocarbon results at Lubbock Lake didn't stand alone for long. As other sites across the Great Plains and Southwest began reporting similarly old dates, many in association with Clovis points or even pre-Clovis lithics, the entire model of North American peopling began to shift. The neat Clovis first migration story began to fray, replaced by a more complex picture of earlier entry, diverse roots, and multiple cultural traditions. But Lubbock Lake held firm in that uncertainty. Its layers didn't offer just one early date. They offered a sequence, showing occupation patterns across thousands of years. Paleo-Indian, archaic, ceramic, proto-historic, not a straight line of progress, but a mosaic of lifeways adapting to changing water, climate, and animal populations. What makes the early radiocarbon data from Lubbock Lake especially haunting is how little spectacle surrounds it. The site isn't cinematic. There's no grand structure, no single mind-blowing artifact that gets its own museum case. Instead, the early occupation level is defined by process: bones cleaned, hides scraped, firewood burned. Daily life, ordinary behavior, except it happened more than 11,000 years ago. That ordinariness is disorienting, because it forces us to see Paleo-Indians not as distant figures in loincloths chasing mammoths, but as people with routines, people with places, people who understood where to find bison, how to track them, when to butcher, what to leave behind, and when to move on. The radiocarbon data didn't just give us a date, it gave us continuity, a kind of prehistoric scheduling. These people didn't just stumble across the site, they returned and re-returned, as if Lubbock Lake had a presence, a memory, a role in a broader seasonal rhythm we can only guess at. But the power of the site's early dating extends beyond archaeology. It touches a deeper human discomfort, the realization that most of history is undocumented, invisible, and irretrievable, unless, by some unlikely luck, a fire was lit and the charcoal saved. And even then, the moment is partial. A date is not a name. A butchery site is not a culture. The radiocarbon results tell us when people were here but not who they were, or what they believed, or how they grieved, or which stars they followed on cold nights. That absence is part of the mystery, because for every site like Lubbock Lake that delivers answers, there are others that only deepen the confusion. Places where the materials don't quite line up, where styles split inexplicably, where people painted one thing on the canyon walls and something completely different on the rocks they carried with them. Which brings us next to the lower Pecos, once again, to the strange visual divergence between portable art and wall art. The same time period, the same region, and yet, the pigments don't match. The materials don't overlap. Two bodies of imagery that seem to speak different dialects of the same forgotten language. Lower Pecos, mobiliary versus parietal puzzle. In the lower Pecos Canyonlands, that stretch of south-central Texas where the rock breathes stories and the rivers carve out time itself, there's a tension no one's been able to resolve. It's not between people and nature, or predator and prey. It's between two forms of expression, two forms of memory, two modes of visual thought that coexist in space and time, but not in style. Archaeologists refer to it as the mobiliary versus parietal puzzle, a fancy way of saying, why do the painted pebbles look nothing like the murals on the walls? Both kinds of art come from the same region, the lower Pecos. Both appear to have been made by the same general cultural groups. Both are found in rock shelters. Both show up in burials, caches, and ritual spaces, and both date to roughly the same periods, from around 4,000 to 1,500 years ago. But here's the twist: they don't match. The parietal art, that is, the murals on the canyon walls, is grand, multi-layered, mythic. It includes large anthropomorphic figures, complex cosmograms, dotted lines, hybrid animal beings, and scenes that seem to depict spiritual journeys, cosmological maps, or metaphysical events. These works are painted in iron-rich pigments, red ochre, yellow iron oxide, and sometimes black manganese. They're fixed in place, immovable, immersive. In contrast, the mobiliary art, the painted pebbles, is small, portable, and repetitive. Pebbles are typically about the size of a human palm and painted in geometric patterns, abstract lines, or highly stylized mask-like faces. They're found in caches and burials, not on public display. And here's where it gets weird. Chemical analysis of the black pigment used on pebbles reveals it's different from the black used on murals. The red paints don't always match either. So the question is, why the split? If the same people made both kinds of art, why use different materials? Why adopt different visual languages? Were these different messages for different audiences? Was one sacred, the other profane? Or were they created by entirely different subsets of society, men versus women, elders versus youth, initiates versus outsiders? One possibility is functional differentiation. The murals may have been collective, ceremonial statements, narratives meant to be seen, shared, possibly even performed in front of. They may have been tied to seasonal rituals or myth reenactments. The painted pebbles, on the other hand, might have been personal amulets, identity markers, or tokens used in individual rites of passage. If that's true, then the pigment differences might reflect contextual pragmatism, different binders or minerals used for different purposes. Portable art might require pigments that adhere well to smoothed rock. Murals, being exposed to light and rain, needed durability, but even that explanation doesn't quite hold up, because in some cases, the same shelter contains both, and still, the palettes don't align. Another theory is symbolic dichotomy. What if the difference isn't technical, but ideological? What if the murals and pebbles reflect dual aspects of a cosmology, public versus private, upper world versus underworld, sky versus earth? In many traditional societies, different symbolic colors and motifs correspond to different realms or beings. The painted pebbles might represent the hidden world, the inner self, or the spirit companions, while the murals serve as gateways, stories etched into the living rock of the outer world. This model would make the split intentional, a designed separation, an encoded system that we've only scratched the surface of. There's also the question of ritual secrecy. Some indigenous traditions require the concealment of sacred symbols from uninitiated eyes. What's meant to be carried close to the body like a painted pebble is not to be displayed. Murals, meanwhile, might depict more mythic or general imagery, safe for communal engagement. But if the difference is about secrecy, then why do we sometimes find pebbles in burials? Were they sent with the dead as spiritual guides? Were they tokens of identity in the afterlife? Or were they simply remnants of a ritual discarded or offered once their use was complete? The fact that we're asking these questions points to the real issue. We don't have the code. We have fragments, half a grammar, artifacts pulled from their context by erosion, excavation, and time. And the division goes deeper. Even stylistically, the two art forms resist synthesis. Murals are expansive, flowing, complex. Pebbles are confined, condensed, and highly structured. It's like comparing symphonies to haikus. Both can carry meaning, but they operate under very different rules. This disconnect challenges our assumptions about prehistoric art. We want consistency, cohesion, a clear narrative arc. But what we get in the lower Pecos is contrast, coexistence without clarity, juxtaposition without fusion. And maybe that's the point. Maybe what we're seeing isn't confusion, but deliberate compartmentalization. A visual language split down the middle, one part carved into place, the other designed to move. One permanent, one intimate, one visible to all, one touched only by a few. But if the canyon walls held the sky stories and the pebbles held the heart stories, then what did the landscape itself hold? Because just beyond the canyon's reach, in the desert shadows of Big Bend, other shapes appear not painted but built, not vertical but horizontal. Stone lines, rings, and formations laid across the ground like giant cryptic signatures. They don't move. They don't speak. And yet, they suggest something deeply intentional. Something arranged. Something we still can't explain. Petroforms of Big Bend. In the high desert stillness of Big Bend, where the Rio Grande snakes through volcanic outcrops and the silence can stretch for miles, there are patterns carved into the landscape that don't quite fit the scenery. You won't find them on the official trail maps. They're not marked by interpretive signs or roped off with caution tape. But if you hike the ridgelines just above the river terrace, especially near the Maravillas and Boquillas formations, you might stumble onto something strange. Circles, lines, spirals, and arrangements of stones laid flat on the ground. These are the so-called petroforms of Big Bend, a term archaeologists use cautiously because the moment you acknowledge pattern, you're also acknowledging intention. And intention is where the mystery begins. These stone arrangements aren't natural. They're clearly deliberate. Small cairns stacked precisely, rings measuring several meters across. Alignments of rock that run straight for dozens of feet before abruptly ending or bending. No inscriptions, no carvings, just form, geometry, space made symbolic. But symbolic of what? That's the question. Because petroforms as a class of archaeological feature are notoriously hard to interpret. They don't contain artifacts. They don't leave behind bones or pottery. They don't announce their purpose. They're shadows of action, not the action itself. In other parts of North America, petroforms are better understood. The Anishinaabe of the upper Midwest used them as teaching tools, story maps, and spiritual diagrams encoded in stone. Some align with solstices or celestial events. Others mark paths, territorial boundaries, or ritual spaces. But in Big Bend, we don't have a living oral tradition to connect these forms to. There are no surviving stories tied to them, just the stones, and their stubborn refusal to explain themselves. Some archaeologists argue that the petroforms in Big Bend were the footprints of temporary campsites, the outlines of wickiups or brush shelters similar to those found at Squatted Peak. Others suggest they may have served as windbreaks, tool-working platforms, or ceremonial markers. But most of these explanations fall short when applied to the more complex arrangements. especially the ones that show axial symmetry, or that seem to align with natural features like distant peaks or notches in the skyline. The challenge is compounded by context. The Chihuahuan Desert is not a forgiving place for preservation. Wind, erosion, and sparse vegetation mean these petroforms are always at risk, constantly shifting, sometimes partially buried, sometimes broken by cattle or overlooked by hikers. The fragile ones may already be gone. What makes the surviving forms so compelling, however, is not just their shape, it's their placement. Many lie just above major springs or along prehistoric travel corridors. Others cluster on overlooks with sweeping views of the river valley below. These aren't random positions. They seem to mean something, even if we can't yet say what. One interpretation holds that the petroforms functioned as ritual stations, places where travelers paused to observe, honor, or enter into a different state of awareness. In this model, the form itself isn't the message, it's the frame for the experience, a place to align body, shadow, and memory. Another possibility is that the petroforms were territorial markers, laid down by communities trying to establish presence without permanence. A silent language of boundaries and belonging. If so, then what we're looking at isn't art, it's negotiation. Then there's the astronomical hypothesis. A few of the alignments seem to track solar rise and set points not perfectly, but closely enough to invite scrutiny. Were these archaeoastronomical devices? Stone calendars for solstices or equinoxes? That's a tempting idea. But without more data, without more preserved sites, it's hard to test. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Big Bend petroforms. They resist being absorbed into our neat categories. They don't look like the effigy mounds of the Midwest. They don't behave like the geoglyphs of the Southwest. They're their own thing, local, specific, yet echoing the same human impulse to mark the land with intention. Because even if the function is lost, the fact of presence is not. Someone knelt down here, chose these stones, placed them in this pattern, looked up at the same sun, the same stars, the same emptiness, and in that moment, made the landscape say something, even if we can no longer hear the words. But just as stone can hold mystery in its stillness, so can bone. And not far from here, in another Texas shelter, the ancient remains of bison, their bones blackened and broken, whisper of a different kind of intention, not symbolic, not peaceful, but purposeful, and possibly fiery. Bonfire Shelter. Bonebed Fires. Bonfire Shelter is a site that refuses to sit quietly in any single category. Part kill site, part kitchen, part funeral pyre, part accident. It's located in a narrow canyon near Langtree, Texas, perched on the edge of the lower Pecos, and it's already made its mark in prehistory as the location of one of the oldest bison jumps in North America. But while the massive bone bed there has been a wellspring of Paleo-Indian insight, it's also a source of one of the region's most smoldering debates, literally. Because some of the bison bones in the shelter aren't just broken or crushed, they're burned, singed black, charred through, and no one agrees on why. There are 3 dominant theories, each one logical, each one inconveniently lacking conclusive evidence. The first, the burns were the result of field butchering and cooking. After the bison were driven off the cliff or otherwise killed en masse, the hunters set fires to help process the meat, maybe even to clean the site afterward. In this version, the burning is intentional, part of a broader communal effort to manage the overwhelming bounty of the hunt. It makes sense, especially when you consider the logistical nightmare of processing multiple massive animals in a remote canyon. Fire could have been used to loosen hides, burn off hair, discourage scavengers, or smoke meat for preservation. But there's a problem: inconsistency. The burning isn't uniform. Some bones are charred, others right next to them aren't. And the burning appears to cut across multiple layers separated by centuries, making it hard to argue for a single, organized cookout. Theory 2. The fires weren't human at all. They were natural grass fires. Lightning strikes are common in the region, especially during dry seasons, and a single spark could ignite a canyon-wide inferno. In this model, the bone beds were already in place when wildfires swept through, scorching the exposed remains, a kind of unintended cremation by the landscape itself. This explanation accounts for the patchy burn patterns. It also lines up with the local fire ecology after all. The lower Pecos brush country has burned many, many times. But if the fires were purely natural, why do some layers show what looks like purposeful stacking of wood and brush? And why are some burn levels sandwiched between clear cultural deposits? The timeline gets fuzzy. Intent gets harder to rule out. Then comes Theory 3, the one that sits in the uneasy space between utility and ritual, that the fires were part of a deliberate destruction event, maybe a form of symbolic cleansing, or even a mortuary act for the animals themselves. In this version, the burning isn't about meat or danger, it's about meaning. Some indigenous traditions view mass hunts as spiritually potent events requiring ritual closure. Perhaps the people who used bonfire shelter weren't just managing resources, but relationships with the land, the animals, the unseen forces that governed both. A fire, in that context, could serve as a final word, a gesture of respect, or warning. The truth might be some combination of all three. A field butchering fire, overtaken by a grass fire, later reinterpreted as sacred. Prehistoric life wasn't cleanly categorized, and neither is this. What makes the mystery endure is the evidence that multiple fires occurred over time, some thousands of years apart. That suggests not just a single event, but a pattern. A site that kept drawing people back, for reasons that were practical, emotional, maybe even cosmological. And each time they returned, they altered the record just a little more. The bone bed fires remain a stubborn question mark in a canyon full of bones and intentions. Not quite a kitchen, not quite a shrine, something between. But bones and fire aren't the only motifs that speak in echoes across time. At another site far to the west, where the desert air turns thinner and the stones bear painted faces, we find signs that the boundaries between cultures may have been more porous than we assumed. Because there, among the sacred masks of Hueco tanks, some figures don't just look local, they look foreign, ancient, and maybe Mesoamerican. Masked figures Mesoamerican links at Hueco. Hueco Tanks, the desert sanctuary east of El Paso, already feels like a threshold between sand and stone, earth and sky, past and presence. The pictographs that crowd its boulders and overhangs include everything from simple line drawings to elaborate polychrome compositions. But among the most enigmatic are the masked figures painted personae that don't just obscure identity, but hint at entirely different worlds. More than 200 mask images have been documented at Hueco Tanks, each with its own distinct style. Ovoid faces with exaggerated eyes, concentric headgear, radiating lines that resemble solar flares or plumes. And a handful of these figures look familiar, uncomfortably familiar. To scholars of Mesoamerica, they bear a striking resemblance to figures from central Mexican traditions, especially Tlaloc, the goggle-eyed rain god, and Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity often shown with elaborate regalia and serpentine motifs. This raises an unsettling question. What is central Mexican iconography doing in a remote West Texas rock shelter? The connection isn't casual. Some of the Hueco figures exhibit classic Tlaloc attributes: round, goggled eyes, jagged lines resembling water or lightning, and headdresses that mirror the war serpent style seen at sites like Teotihuacan and Tula. Others feature split tongues, curling motifs, or dual-faced designs, hallmarks of Mesoamerican dualism. One theory is cultural diffusion. During the late prehistoric period, roughly 900–1400 CE, trade routes were flourishing across the southwest and Mesoamerica. Shells from the Gulf Coast made it into the deserts of Arizona. Turquoise from the southwest ended up in central Mexico. Ceramics, obsidian, copper, all moved through these networks. If goods moved, so did ideas. Stories, symbols, rituals. Hueco Tanks may have been a ceremonial stop along a vast pilgrimage network linking the Jornada Mogollon peoples of West Texas to broader spiritual systems. The masked figures, in this case, would represent hybrid deities, local interpretations of foreign gods, filtered through regional belief systems. But there's another possibility, convergent symbolism, that these figures look Mesoamerican but aren't, that the Jornada developed their own iconographic language, one that just happens to echo Mesoamerican aesthetics because they drew from the same elemental toolkit: rain, sun, fertility, death. After all, thunder sounds the same on both sides of a desert. And when you live in a land that relies on unpredictable rain, you might independently imagine gods who control the clouds and give them goggle eyes. Still, the similarities are hard to dismiss, and the overlap isn't limited to imagery. Some archaeologists have noted parallels in ceramic styles, ritual architecture, and even burial practices between Jornada sites and their Mesoamerican counterparts. So what was Hueco Tanks, really? A desert outpost mimicking a distant empire? A crossroads of belief systems? A spiritual experiment in which iconography drifted across cultural boundaries like pollen? The masked figures don't answer. They only stare. Expressionless. Unreadable. Set into the rock like invitations to a story we can't quite translate. But they're not the only symbols that hint at far-flung connections. Across Texas, in sites as disparate as the Edwards Plateau and the Rio Grande Valley, artifacts appear that have no business being there: shell pendants, exotic stone tools, materials from coasts hundreds of miles away. Which means the belief systems weren't just shared. The people were moving, talking, trading, mapping invisible highways across the prehistoric landscape. And the next mystery begins not with gods or symbols, but with the objects they carried, and the web of exchange that tied prehistoric Texas to distant shores. Trade webs into the Edwards Plateau. The Edwards Plateau is a land of limestone and echoes. Its canyons whisper with wind, and its rivers run clear but hidden beneath layers of brush and thyme. It's a rugged place, not unfriendly, but never easy. And yet, for thousands of years, people kept coming here, not just for water, game, or stone, but for something harder to trace: connection. Because across this rocky heartland of Texas, archaeologists keep finding things that don't belong. Shell pendants made from Gulf Coast mollusks, marine shell beads found miles inland, stone tools crafted from materials that don't occur anywhere nearby. These aren't the remains of solitary wanderers. They're the fingerprints of trade, long distance, persistent, and far more complex than we once thought. The Edwards Plateau wasn't just a homeland, it was a hub. Take Bering Sinkhole, for example. We've already discussed it as a mortuary site, a vertical shaft filled with the dead. But what's equally remarkable is what was buried with them. Among the grave goods recovered from Bering were marine shell ornaments, including whole pendants and bead fragments. These objects originated from coastal environments, likely transported over 300 miles inland. They weren't raw materials. They were worked pieces, crafted with intent and carried with care. That distance, in an age without roads or wheels, is no small thing. It suggests not a single traveler, but a network, a chain of exchanges stretching from the Gulf Coast into the interior, and likely beyond. The people of the Edwards Plateau were part of something larger, a web of movement that tied together coast and desert, plain and canyon. And it wasn't just shells. Obsidian, for example, turns up in small quantities. Not from local sources, there are none, but likely from New Mexico or northern Mexico. Other sites on the plateau have yielded copper beads, sourced to the Great Lakes. Chert and flint tools sometimes show flaking styles that hint at northern or western influences, even if the raw material is local. So, how did these goods move? Not in caravans, not in wagons, but through informal relay, person to person, group to group, across seasonal gatherings, intermarriages, alliances, and shared rituals. Trade in prehistoric Texas wasn't transactional the way we think of it today. It was relational. You didn't just exchange a shell for a stone. You exchanged trust, stories, obligations. In that context, the presence of non-local items in Central Texas becomes a kind of social code. The shell pendant wasn't just jewelry, it was a signifier, a way to show who you knew, where you'd been, or what you'd earned. It might even have been a mark of initiation, a badge of status, or a passport into certain rituals. And yet, despite all this traffic, there's a paradox. The plateau doesn't have many permanent settlements. Most sites appear seasonal, temporary. So this trade network wasn't rooted in cities or market centers, it was networked through mobility, a distributed system, one that left only scattered traces and no central ledger. That's part of what makes it so difficult to reconstruct. The routes are invisible, the transactions undocumented, the meaning encoded in materials we don't fully understand. Were there professional traders? Probably not in the modern sense. But there were certainly people whose role, formal or informal, was to carry stories in the form of objects, to bridge worlds, to act as cultural links between places that otherwise had no reason to touch. The Edwards Plateau was not isolated. It was entangled. And in those entanglements, we catch glimpses of something even more elusive than material culture, shared meaning. But not every shared space was about goods. Some were about endings, about choosing the place where one should enter the earth. Because across the plateau and the lower Pecos, there's another pattern that emerges, a pattern of shelters and sinkholes used again and again, not for food, not for fire, but for burial. And the mystery isn't just why they were used, it's why those places were chosen, and what they meant to the people who returned to them across generations. Why certain shelters became cemeteries. Across prehistoric Texas, especially in the Edwards Plateau and lower Pecos regions, there's a recurring theme in the archaeological record. Certain rock shelters, sinkholes, and limestone crevices were used again and again as burial spaces. Not every shelter, not every hollow in the cliff, just some select few. And that selection is what makes the mystery. Why were these locations chosen to house the dead? What made one overhang sacred and another ignored? The answer, if it exists, has eroded, leaving behind bones, charcoal, the occasional grave good, and a palpable sense that meaning once filled the air like smoke. At sites like Seminole Sink, Bering Sinkhole, and Fate Bell Shelter, archaeologists have uncovered human remains buried with care and consistency, often over spans of hundreds or even thousands of years. In many cases, the burials are layered, earlier bodies laid to rest at the base, with later individuals interred atop or beside them, often disturbed or rearranged by time or ritual reuse. These were not casual interments. They were repeat performances, suggesting cultural memory and ceremonial importance. The living knew who had been buried before, or at least knew that the place had been used. And they came back anyway. So why return to a burial shelter? One explanation is spiritual geography, the idea that certain natural spaces carried cosmological weight. In many indigenous belief systems, caves and crevices serve as portals to other worlds, entrances to the underworld, places where spirits dwell or ancestors wait. By placing the dead there, communities may have been ensuring a safe passage into those realms. It's also possible these shelters were used not just for burial, but for ongoing interaction with the dead. The placement of bodies near hearths, food remains, and other signs of habitation suggests that the line between the living and the departed was more permeable than we tend to imagine. These weren't tombs. They were communal spaces, part home, part grave, part shrine. There's also the matter of liminality. Rock shelters exist in thresholds not fully outside, not fully inside. That in-between quality may have been symbolically significant. The dead weren't sent far away. They were kept close, but at the edge of the world, accessible, but apart. Interestingly, these burial shelters rarely show signs of trauma or conflict. The dead were not dumped, they were placed, some curled in fetal positions, some wrapped in fiber mats, a few adorned with painted pebbles or beads. These small gestures imply more than respect, they imply intimacy. And then, there's the question of location memory. How did people remember these sacred spots across centuries of movement? The answer may lie in oral tradition. Without writing, people preserved knowledge through stories, performances, songs. It's likely that children were brought to these places, told the names of those buried there, reminded of their own place in the lineage. That makes the burial shelter not just a physical space, but a mnemonic device, a teaching tool as much as a tomb. But still, we don't know why some places were chosen while others weren't. Was it the way light entered at dawn, the proximity to water, the echo of a voice calling into the stone? We can only guess. What we do know is that this tradition wasn't unique to one culture or one era. It spanned time, changed form, and it left behind a scattered constellation of sites that, when viewed together, sketch the outline of a belief system where death was not an exit, but a continuation, one that needed space, ritual, and stone to take shape. And fittingly, the very walls of these shelters, the same ones that house the dead, were sometimes painted, marked with symbols, layered with meaning. And just as those burials stretched across generations, so too did the art, growing, evolving, resisting erasure. But when, exactly, was that art made? And how do we sync the symbols on the walls with the rest of this deep time puzzle? That question of dating, of sequence, of visual evolution is the next unsolved chapter. One written not in ink, but in pigment and patience. Chronology of Lower Pecos art. In the stone-thick silence of the Lower Pecos, the canyon walls aren't just backdrops. They're canvases, vast, enduring, and confusing. They hold layers of painted figures, red, black, yellow, and white human-animal hybrids, lines of dots, arcing bands, strange headdresses, antlered beings, and serpentine swirls that seem less drawn than summoned. These murals are some of the most spectacular prehistoric rock art in North America. And yet, for a long time, no one could say exactly when they were made. The question of chronology, the simple act of putting these images in time, has proved maddeningly difficult. Rock doesn't come with a timestamp. Pigment doesn't announce its age. And the shelters themselves have often been used for millennia, creating a visual palimpsest where older images are painted over, beside, or even into newer ones. For decades, archaeologists could only guess. Some argued the paintings were archaic, maybe 4,000 years old. Others thought they were much younger, drawn by proto-historic or even early colonial peoples. The images were too strange, too abstract, too layered to fit cleanly into any single cultural box. Then came science. In the last 20 years, researchers have begun to apply a suite of methods to get closer to actual dates. Radiocarbon analysis of organic materials in paint, PXRF, portable X-ray fluorescence, to study the elemental composition of pigments, stratigraphic association with buried artifacts, and even relative sequencing of art styles, by examining superimpositions, who painted over whom, and in what order. What emerged was both clarifying and confounding. First, the oldest images are indeed archaic, possibly dating back 4,000 years or more. The monumental panels at sites like Panther Cave, White Shaman, and Fate Bell Shelter were likely painted between 2500 BCE and 500 CE. A span of over 2,000 years. That alone is staggering. It means that some panels we see as unified may actually contain imagery made centuries apart, layered by generations who spoke different languages, worshipped different deities, and perhaps no longer fully understood the earlier images they painted beside. Second, the art isn't just one tradition. Researchers now talk about styles: Pecos River style, red linear style, red monochrome, and so on. Each has its own motifs, color palettes, and compositional rules. Pecos River style is the most complex large-scale panels with abstract, shamanic beings arranged in narrative formations. Red linear, by contrast, is sparse, often featuring stick figures and animals drawn in quick, fluid strokes. And these styles don't follow a simple linear timeline. Some overlap, some reappear, some mutate. That suggests that Lower Pecos art isn't the product of a single culture, but a long conversation, a visual tradition passed down, interpreted and reinterpreted over millennia. A sacred wall that kept being rewritten, not because the original message was lost, but because each new generation had something to add. Still, challenges remain. Radiocarbon dating is incredibly hard on rock art. Paints often contain little or no organic material. Samples must be tiny too large, and you risk destroying the image. And even when dates are obtained, they only reflect when the material was made, not when it was applied. A chunk of red ochre could be 3,000 years old and still used in a painting yesterday. That's where PXRF comes in. By analyzing the elemental fingerprint of pigments, scientists can compare paints across sites. If two images 100 miles apart use the same rare blend of iron and manganese, it may suggest a shared source or even shared ritual knowledge. Some studies have begun to map these pigment clusters, revealing regional connections that stretch across the canyonlands. And then there's the human element, the brushstrokes, the decision-making. Some panels show incredible planning figures, spaced perfectly, lines running without hesitation. Others seem spontaneous, almost chaotic. One moment you're staring at a symmetrical cosmic map, the next at a cluster of red dots like spilled blood. Was that an intentional contrast? Or the result of two painters separated by 600 years? No one knows. But the more we study these images, the more they feel like a form of time travel, not back to a single era, but into a layered, recursive cultural memory. They are both ancient and active, both grounded and metaphysical. They speak in a grammar we can't yet decode, using words we still don't know how to pronounce. And maybe that's what art this old is supposed to do. Not explain, but invite. Not define, but disturb. Because just when we think we've begun to understand the logic of prehistoric intention of why people left symbols on stone, we come to Rockwall County. A place where the art isn't painted, the wall isn't drawn, and the structure may not even be man-made. The rock wall of Rockwall County. Let's start with the obvious. Yes, Rockwall County is named after an actual rock wall. It's not a metaphor, not a branding decision. The town of Rockwall, northeast of Dallas, in the Blackland Prairie, owes its name to a buried, seemingly constructed stone formation that early settlers stumbled upon in the mid-19th century. What they uncovered was bizarre. Long, linear, interlocking rock walls beneath the surface, running for dozens of feet, sometimes stacked in multiple levels, with 90-degree corners and a masonry-like precision that didn't look natural. Farmers digging wells or cellars would hit the wall, follow it a ways, and come up with the same question: who built this? And when? Rumors erupted. Theories abounded. Some said it was Native American. Others insisted it was Spanish colonial. A few whispered of Atlantis, giants, or even a pre-flood civilization that vanished long before recorded history. The idea of an ancient wall, man-made, mysterious, and buried beneath East Texas soil, captured the imagination of locals and cranks alike. But the story didn't stay in the realm of folklore. Geologists were called in, and starting in the 20th century, experts began examining the wall more closely. Their verdict? It's natural. Specifically, they identified the structure as a clastic dike, a natural sedimentary feature formed when sand or mud is forced into cracks in harder rock and later solidifies. Over time, erosion reveals these dikes as vertical or angled walls, often with what appears to be brick-like patterning. The apparent mortar is just mineral banding. The right angles? Coincidence. The stacked formations? A geological accident. Case closed? Not quite, because not everyone buys the explanation. Alternative researchers argue that the formation's uniformity and angles go far beyond what natural processes would produce. Some of the walls even have archways, buttresses, or what appear to be windows. Early photographs show features that look architectural, even if weathered. Others point out that while clastic dikes are real, they usually don't occur in patterns this regular or at this scale. Could this be a natural formation later modified by humans? Could early inhabitants have used the rock as a foundation or structure, adding to what was already there? More provocative still, some claim to have found carvings on certain sections, shapes, glyphs, indentations that don't look like erosion. But these claims remain unverified, mostly anecdotal, and often steeped in fringe theory. Mainstream science continues to categorize the Rockwall Formation as a geological oddity rare but explainable, and yet no full excavation has ever been conducted. Most of the formation remains buried, running beneath roads, parking lots, and suburban neighborhoods. It flickers into view only when someone digs deep enough, then disappears again, leaving behind another photograph, another rumor. In that sense, the rock wall is more than a wall. It's a mirror, reflecting our need for mystery, our desire to find ancient structure where there may be only chance, our longing to believe that history is deeper, older, and more intentional than we've been told. Is it a wall? Maybe. Is it a mystery? Absolutely. And it won't be the last, because just beyond Rockwall County, the ancient quarries of Alibates whisper of something more quantifiable movement. Flint mined from one place, found in another. Tools that walked farther than the people who made them. The story of prehistoric Texas wasn't just stationary. It was mobile, wide-reaching, and sometimes quietly astonishing. How far Alibates Flint traveled. Just north of the Canadian River in the Texas Panhandle, beneath a crust of prairie grass and windblown silence, lies one of the oldest industrial sites in North America. Not industrial in the modern sense. No smokestacks, no machinery, but industrial in what it produced. Tools, blades, points, scrapers, knives, cores. Thousands upon thousands of them, all made from a shimmering, multicolored material that doesn't look like it belongs to the earth at all. This is Alibates flint, a form of agatized dolomite so dense, durable, and sharp when fractured that it became a prehistoric Texas export. But the real mystery isn't that it was quarried. The mystery is just how far it traveled and what that says about the people who used it. First, a detail. Alibates flint doesn't look like typical gray chert. It comes in reds, oranges, purples, even pale blues layered in wild bands, formed from ancient Permian-era seabeds and polished by time into a visual spectacle. Its quality is elite. It fractures conchoidally, like glass, which means you can flake it with exquisite control. And ancient peoples knew that. They knew it immediately. Evidence of flint extraction here dates back more than 13,000 years. Hundreds of pits dot the Alibates quarries dug by hand, deep and precise, many surrounded by discarded flakes and broken cores. These weren't casual gatherers. These were specialists, people who understood the raw material, its fracture patterns, and its value. This was not just a resource, it was a craft economy. But what makes Alibates truly exceptional isn't the quarry itself. It's where the stone ends up. Archaeologists have found Alibates flint artifacts hundreds and even thousands of miles away, deep into the plains, across the Southwest, and even as far east as the Mississippi Valley. Clovis points made from Alibates flint have been discovered in Colorado, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. Later, during the Archaic and Ceramic periods, the material continues to surface in contexts that make no immediate geographical sense. There was no Amazon, no freight, no wheels, and yet this stone mined in the Panhandle made it into the hands of people hundreds of miles away. How? Not through solitary wandering. The pattern is too broad, too consistent. What we're looking at is exchange, and not just short-distance trade between neighbors. We're talking about long-distance, multi-step transmission, a relay of stone and meaning, moving from camp to camp, site to site, possibly even wrapped in ritual or symbolic significance. It's entirely possible that Alibates flint was more than just practical, that it was prestige material, something people desired, not just for cutting, but for what it represented: access, skill, connection. Holding a knife made from Alibates flint might have meant you had ties to powerful groups, or that you were worthy of receiving something beautiful and deadly from a land you'd never seen. But what really baffles researchers is the directionality of this trade. You'd expect flint to flow outward from the quarry in a kind of natural diffusion. But in some regions, the presence of Alibates seems strangely selective. It appears in specific ceremonial sites, but not in nearby settlements. It turns up in elite burials, but not among ordinary trash pits. That implies a social filter, an invisible logic to who received it and why. Was it bartered in formal exchanges, gifted in rituals, carried by travelers on pilgrimage? Some believe there were seasonal gatherings, cross-regional meetups where trade, marriage alliances, and ceremonial games took place. Others argue for less formal roots, objects passed along organically as people moved, each handoff carrying a little less context, but still honoring the material. Today, if you visit the Alibates Flint Quarries National Monument, you'll find a landscape that looks almost unmarked. Gentle ridges, soft wind, the occasional dug pit filled with fallen leaves. But beneath that silence is a legacy of motion of stone that refused to stay still. And with it comes the deeper implication. Prehistoric Texas wasn't isolated. It was connected. Its people weren't just surviving, they were participating in something vast, something networked, something that required memory, trust, and miles. But even as trade tied people across distances, the coast told a different story. A story written not in flint or pigment, but in shells piled high, left in place, and arranged not in patterns of movement, but in cycles of presence and absence. Because the final mystery isn't how far people traveled, it's why, at certain times, they stopped and built monuments not of stone, but of clam. Why big coastal shellworks waxed and waned. All along the Gulf Coast of Texas, from the mouths of bayous to the inner reaches of tidal estuaries, lie enormous mounds of clamshells, Rangia cuneata, to be precise. Their pale, chalky fragments glitter in the sun, piled in long ridges or dome-shaped heaps, sometimes stretching hundreds of meters. They don't look like much, especially if you're moving fast. But slow down, and they tell a different story, one of abundance, intention, and enigma. These are shellworks, prehistoric accumulations of food waste, campsite debris, ceremonial residue, or perhaps all three, and like so many ancient features, the mystery isn't that they exist. It's why they exist in waves, why they appear in dense clusters during certain periods and then vanish, only to return again centuries later. The earliest shellworks on the Texas coast date back several thousand years. Some of the most prominent are near Galveston Bay, Copano Bay, and around the mouths of the Brazos and Nueces rivers. In many cases, the shell heaps are enormous, some with over 1 million individual clamshells, stacked and restacked across layers of occupation. That suggests long-term, repeated use, possibly semi-permanent settlement. And yet, these sites don't show constant habitation. They come and go. Some are used heavily for a few hundred years, then abandoned. Others lie dormant for generations before people return. It's a pattern of cyclical intensity, and it doesn't map cleanly onto known environmental changes or population shifts. So, what's driving the rhythm? One theory is climate and hydrology. Rangia clams thrive in brackish water, the kind you get where rivers meet the sea. But those conditions aren't constant. Storm surges, droughts, river diversions, all can disrupt salinity levels. If the clam beds die off, there's no reason to stay. When they return, so do the people. That makes sense in part, but it doesn't explain the scale. Some shellworks suggest not just subsistence, but coordination, multiple hearths, repeated dump zones, even patterns that resemble platforms or leveled areas, possibly used for ceremonies or social gatherings. In that model, shellworks aren't just garbage piles. They're intentional constructions, places of meeting, memory, maybe even identity. Another clue lies in the variation of materials. Some shellworks contain only rangia. Others include oyster, mussel, even terrestrial snail. That diversity may signal different groups or different functions. Some were strictly seasonal camps. Others may have been ritual centers used during certain lunar or tidal cycles. A few may have been residential bases, occupied year-round. But then, they stop. There are whole stretches of coastline where shellworks vanish for centuries, even though the environment was stable. Why? Some archaeologists suggest shifts in mobility. As trade routes developed inland, coastal groups may have adopted more nomadic lifeways. Others argue for cultural transition, a shift in food preferences, ritual practice, or group identity that made shellworking obsolete. But the most haunting possibility is social reorganization. That these sites weren't abandoned because of clams, but because of people. That, the traditions tying them to place fractured, and with them, the entire logic of coastal life. Today, many shellworks lie buried beneath development. Others are eroded by storm surge and sea level rise. What remains is fragmentary, uneven, sometimes mistaken for modern trash dumps. But every fragment whispers of a time when the coast was alive with purpose not just as a food source, but as a stage for human life. People ate, gathered, sang, buried, returned, and then stopped. Not because the world ended, but because something changed. And the truth of that change, like so many in prehistoric Texas, is still out there, not lost, just waiting, in the shallow soil, in the quiet silt, in the broken clamshell that says, someone was here, and they knew what they were doing, even if we no longer do.